Chapter 268. Crack, the last robot was cleaved in half from top to bottom. White Knight withdrew his blade of light. He wasn't wearing a protective suit like Sula and the others, but he didn't seem to feel the cold at all, just like the robots. Sula and her companions performed basic first aid on their wounded teammates. After confirming that their lives were no longer in danger, Sula walked up to White Knight. "Why are you here?" White Knight shot her a glance before kicking the chopped robots to a corner. He said expressionlessly, "Teacher Guan." Sula looked surprised for a moment before understanding dawned on her. As expected, she couldn't hide anything from Guan Feng. "Thanks. You're the only one." Sula had just asked this question when she saw a snowy white wolf over 150 centimeters tall running toward her. It didn't look disheveled even though it was running in the middle of a snowy field. Instead, it exuded a kind of murderous elegance. When one looked into its eyes, they would discover that it was a proud wolf. It was as if it was giving you a lot of face just by looking you in the eye. "Rubel? Who's with you?" Sula was truly shocked when she saw the snow wolf. She had no idea how these people were alerted. What on earth was Guan Feng thinking? What on earth happened? "Why are you?" Sula looked at White Knight. White Knight put on a protective suit and said in a low voice, "It's so cold." "Sula. So you can feel the cold after all." White Knight was a human too. He wasn't a beast covered in thick fur like Rubel, and he wasn't a robot either. It was just that wearing a thermal suit, protective suit, and breathing mask would affect his movements, and White Knight didn't like to be restrained. That was why he didn't put on the protective suit until he was done with the robots. Rubel was still holding something in its mouth. It was something it had taken out of a robot's head. It ran to White Knight and spat it out, saying, "So hard, much harder than before." The robots Sula and her team had encountered were only a small part of them. There were other robots left behind in the glacier zone, so White Knight and Rubel split up to chase after them. Sula shot a glance at Rubel the snow wolf who was crouching next to her. That bastard was opening his mouth wide and pulling at the badly deformed skin that he had bitten off from the robot with his claws. Sula asked White Knight again, "How many of you are here?" Bai Yi did not reply. He walked over to the snow wolf that was picking its teeth with its paw and patted its head. "Let's go." The people around Sula were very angry at White Knight's attitude. Although White Knight had helped them just now, he was still a very irritating person. He was about to step forward and say something when Sula stopped him. Sula shook her head and motioned for him not to do so. She knew White Knight's way of doing things. "Let's leave for now. The situation has changed. Let's contact our superiors and see if there are any new instructions." "Oh right, let's collect the remains of those robots as well. They might be useful," Sula said. When Silan drove the flying car past the glacier, he noticed that there was no one there anymore. Both White Knight and Sula had already left, and the place where the battle had taken place was buried in snow. At first glance, there was no trace of the battle, but there was a very long crack on an iceberg next to it. It was a testament to the battle that had taken place here. "Naimi, you drive," Silan said. "Ah." Naimi was caught off guard for a moment before he reacted, "Why?" "I'm tired." "Oh, but my abilities are limited. I'll probably be overtaken." Naimi knew his limits. Right now, Vegfritter was temporarily in first place, but the flying car behind it was still hot on its tail. "It's fine. Let Vegfritter help you." After that, Silan made a few settings on the control panel. Then, Silan and Naimi's seats changed. Naimi accepted the controls nervously while Vegfritter cooperated with him. After Silan left the driver's seat, he started working on the navigator's analysis panel. His fingers moved swiftly as he typed in a series of characters. At the same time, many small screens popped up on the analysis panel. Every small screen displayed a different thing. Some showed wave frequency analysis, some showed image analysis, and so many lines of data that Naimi's eyes were dazzled. After a quick glance, Naimi turned his attention away from Sillin and focused on driving. Sillin had deduced a lot of things through the analysis device installed on Vegfritter. He knew that the robots had appeared here, and he had located the place where they appeared. He had taken video clips from the media and the Sizer family's surveillance cameras and processed them, and he saw the crack on the iceberg. Other than that, Sillin had also located the place where the snow wolves had chased after the robots. So Sula and the others had come here to deal with Black Viper's robots. There were a lot of details that Sillin didn't understand, but there was one thing that Sillin was clear about. He had sensed the robots at the rainforest earlier, and they had appeared again during this circuit. That meant that they would definitely appear in the rest of the circuits as well. He didn't know if Sula and the others could stop the robots though. While Sillin was analyzing, Naimi had already started sprinting. The circuit was almost over. It was nightfall when they arrived at the glacier circuit. Now that the circuit was almost over, the sky was starting to brighten up. Although Naimi had tried his best, he still wasn't as good as the veterans at adapting to the minute changes in the environment. However, thanks to the advantage Sillin had created at the front, their score wasn't bad at all. They were in second place. The first place of this circuit was Lightning's crescent moon. Arrow's flying shuttle was in third place, and Spearhead's flying blade was in fourth place. After the fourth segment ended, there weren't many flying cars that stopped for maintenance. The next segment was a vast desert. The fourth circuit and the fifth circuit could be said to be polar opposites, but it just so happened that the unique terrain and environment had created such a unique circuit. The flying car was still greeted by a sea of white after it charged out of the glacier. Even though it had flown a long way out of the glacier, it was still white from the window. However, when you looked at the temperature displayed on the car, you would notice that the temperature outside wasn't like the glacier at all. It was about the same temperature as the human body. The white was all sand. White sand. The white sand zone was a transition zone between the glacier and the desert. White sand was everywhere in this zone, but the temperature wasn't as high as the center of the desert. It could be said that the temperature here was comfortable, and the air humidity wasn't too low either. "Do you want to switch, Sillin?" Naimi asked. To be honest, although he had made a small mistake during the sprint and didn't get first place, Naimi's interest had been piqued. He really didn't want to switch at the moment. Being a racer was much more exciting than being a navigator. "No need. Continue." Sillin's words delighted Naimi. "Don't worry, I'll do my best." As they continued to fly, the white sand gradually turned into yellow sand. The temperature outside also rose sharply. It wasn't too bad inside the flying car since it had a thermostat, but it wouldn't take long before they turned into dried corpses. He couldn't help but sigh at the tenacity of the natural world. Sillin saw some animals moving through the sand on the car's display. They were so small, so tenacious, and they didn't rely on any machines. They relied on their own adaptability and ability to evolve. Sillin finally noticed an unusual ripple from the analysis screen. It was an unusual ripple that belonged to the robots. It was similar to machine language, but it was disrupted so he couldn't understand what it was trying to say. Sillin tried to locate it, but he discovered that he couldn't pinpoint its exact location. It could be the robot's own interference, or it could be someone else's interference. Either way, there were robots there. It was exactly because he had seen what those robots were capable of that Sillin wasn't in the mood to pay attention to the race at all. What was the point of racing if he was going to die? Fleck had seen Vegfritter's blueprints before, and Naimi was guarding Vegfritter while Sillin was assembling it. However, neither of them knew that Vegfritter was actually equipped with a very hidden weapon system. It was a relatively independent weapon system that was protected by multiple passwords. Right now, Sillin was activating this weapon system again. The weapon system wouldn't affect Naimi's driving much after it was activated, and he didn't even realize that another dangerous program had been activated on the flying car. Since Fleeka's materials were limited, and the production cost was also limited, the weapon system on Vegfritter couldn't really do anything to the robots. It could only buy them some time. Scylla still had some weapons in his ring, including the Purgatory Thunder Snake K and related bullets. He sucked in a deep breath. He couldn't place all his hopes on Sula and the others. Scylla had to plan a way out for himself. Naimi was a member of the Sizer family, and he was getting better and better at driving after the initial awkwardness. He might not be as good as Scylla, but he wasn't far from it. Coupled with Vegfritter's own smart controls, the 4 flying cars were still in the lead. To most people, this was already a miracle. An outdated car model, an eye-popping antique, Vegfritter, had shown enough and won enough recognition in the last 4 circuits. Of course, only those who knew the ropes would know that not everyone could drive a Vegfritter to this level. While Scylla was getting ready to deal with the robots, the abnormal fluctuations on one of the analysis screens suddenly stopped. It was as if the robots didn't exist at all. Scylla stared at the screen for 2 seconds. Then, he swiftly tapped on the other screens to analyze the abnormal fluctuations. In the end, he performed multiple comparisons between the analysis results on the screens, and the result he got was that the robots in the area he had circled earlier were really gone. There were some tiny mechanical fluctuations in other parts of the desert, but they were all far away from the core. Or rather, something must have happened to the robots in the area Scylla circled on the screen. They were either killed by Sula and the others, or someone else. The rest of the robots had fled into the distance. Who could it be? As he got closer and closer to the coordinates Scylla had circled, Scylla paid more and more attention to the changes in this area. He stared closely at the screens in front of him. If a mechanical fluctuation appeared on these screens, Scylla would have to respond immediately even if he had to forfeit the race. The good news was that he didn't detect any mechanical fluctuations here. Instead, there were signs of organic life. It wasn't a native species of the desert, but an alien species. However, because the other party had a jamming device, Scylla couldn't confirm who or what the other party was. That being said, Scylla wasn't as nervous as he was before. The other party had probably killed the robots. If it wasn't Sula and the others, then it was someone else. At the very least, it couldn't be an enemy force. The desert was filled with flying sand, and it was impossible to see what was going on outside through normal vision. However, Scylla could still see a round object not far away from the track through the sandstorm. It was about 2 meters in diameter. The sandstorm had almost buried it completely, but the parts that were exposed were gradually showing scales. After the flying car had flown away, Scylla also vaguely saw the round ball shake off the sand after they had flown away and roll towards a certain direction. It was at a sandstone area in the desert. The tall sandstone blocked the vicious light barrier, and the temperature in the shadow was much lower. Moreover, there was no violent sandstorm here. There was a person lying in a narrow crevice. The person was wearing a sun hat, and the brim of the hat was pulled down low to block the small amount of sand that was rolling towards them. His clothes were tattered. It was hard to tell if they were from a fight or torn by himself, but it was probably both. The person was using his arms as a pillow, his legs crossed and swaying leisurely. The half-rolled-up pants on his thighs swayed with his movements like rags. He looked very relaxed. Not far away from the sandstone, the sand pushed by the wind had buried something. However, it wasn't completely submerged yet. An object at a small corner reflected the light and shone with a metallic luster. If one listened closely, they could even hear the tiny buzzing of electricity underneath the sand. However, the buzzing grew weaker and weaker until it completely stopped. Glug glug glug. A spiky ball rolled over. It was the round ball that Scylla had seen before. The ball got stuck when it rolled into the crevice. Then, it rolled back a bit and charged into the crevice again, only to get stuck again. After a few tries, it finally gave up. If it tried to force its way in like this, it would probably topple over all the sandstones in this area. The spiky ball finally stretched out and revealed its full appearance. It was an armadillo lizard nearly 5 meters long. After stretching its whole body, the armadillo lizard shook off the sand and stones on its body and swaggered into the crevice. It wasn't stuck now. Fong Fong, everything went well. We can start by hand now, the armadillo lizard said to the person sleeping inside. The person called Fong Fong let out a long sigh, as if he was regretting that his leisure time was over. He raised his finger to push the brim of his hat up, revealing a pair of small, narrow eyes under the hat. He glanced at the armadillo lizard that had crawled in, then yawned, stood up slowly, and stretched again. Let's go. Hand by hand. The man and the lizard walked out of the stone area and into the sandstorm. It didn't take long for them to arrive at a small sand dune that wasn't too high. The man raised his hand and patted a part of the sand dune, shouting, "Open the door, we're back." The sandstorm outside is so strong. The patting didn't sound like the patting of a sand dune. As the man patted the sand dune, the layer of sand outside was blown away by the wind, revealing a shell that looked no different from yellow sand. It was the shell of a spaceplane. However, the camouflage, color, material, and sand covered the surface of the spaceplane made it look like a small sand dune. The man shouted and patted for a long time before the spaceplane's hatch finally opened. The man and the lizard entered the spaceplane, and the hatch quickly closed behind them. Inside the spaceplane's cockpit, a little girl who looked to be about 7 or 8 years old was playing a game. She didn't react to the man and the lizard's entrance at all. Her eyes were fixed on the game screen, and her hands were moving non-stop. It was a driving game, a flying car game developed by the Sizer Company not long ago. When the armadillo lizard was about to lie down and rest, the little girl finally spoke up, "Armadillo, you brought in a lot of pollutants again. You'll be responsible for cleaning the spaceplane next time." The armadillo armadillo's crouching motion froze, and then the huge scales on its body that looked like armor almost exploded. "Why? I was the one who cleaned up the spaceplane last time. It's your fault that you didn't shake off the sand when you came in." The little girl's eyes were still fixed on the screen, but her words were directed at the armadillo lizard armadillo. Armadillo rolled his eyes, then raised his tail and pointed at the person lying weakly on the chair. He said to the little girl, "Nikki, I want to report that guy Fong Fong was slacking off today, and I did almost all the work. Look, a piece of scale on my tail was shaved off, and my tail was almost cut off." The person who was lying on the chair sprang up and pointed at his ragged clothes and trousers that were already in the shape of tassels. He complained in an aggrieved tone, "Nonsense. Look at me, these are all traces of battle. I almost ran around naked. You have to help me, big sis Nikki. You have to give me a raise this time." It was strange that a young man who looked to be in his 20s would call a little girl who looked to be 7 or 8 years old, big sis. Nikki snorted while playing the game. "Chila Fong, Armadillo, you two clean the spaceplane together next time." "You're wrong. I'm serious. I'm really working hard. Look at my sincere eyes if you don't believe me." Chila Fong moved closer to Nikki and pointed at his own eyes. The little girl finally put down the game in front of her and turned to look at Chila Fong. She tried hard to find the sincerity in his eyes, which were as thin as a thread even when his eyes were open. Then, she came to a conclusion, "Your eye ulcers are particularly prominent today." Chila Fong didn't feel awkward when he heard this. Instead, he raised a finger and touched the inner corner of his eye. "That's right. I've worked so hard on this hot day that my eyes are dry and tired. They might even get inflamed, or maybe they're already inflamed. It's not easy for me. I need a raise, and a holiday too. It'd be best if I could get a reimbursement for my travel expenses." Armadillo, who was resting on his stomach, twitched his tail and buried his head in silence. After a moment of silence, Chila Fong suddenly stared at Nikki's pointy ears and said, "Hey, big sis Nikki, you're already 35? You were 34 just a while ago, how come you're 35 now?" Nikki's ears were sharper than most people's, and there was a ring of teeth around her ears. The number of teeth represented her actual age. Chila Fong's exclamation was followed by a thump inside the spaceplane, followed by Chila Fong's scream. The desert circuit went relatively smoothly, and Silen's team was still in the top 4. Naimi was incredibly excited, and his nervousness was nowhere near as intense as before. He had picked up his speed as well, but he was still defeated by a centimeter despite being in a good condition. The third place was Arrow's flying car, the second place was Lightning's crescent moon, and the first place was Spearhead's flying blade. 5 out of 7 stages of the race had passed, and the final score of the top 4 was as follows: Arrow's flying shuttle 150 points, Lightning's crescent moon 145 points, Silen's Vegfritter 145 points, and Spearhead's flying blade 140 points. There wasn't much of a difference between the 4 cars, and anyone could have won the race. There were still 2 more circuits to go, and no one could tell what would happen next. Naimi looked a little depressed after exiting the 5th circuit. Moreover, he had maintained a high level of nervousness and concentration, so he was severely dehydrated and exhausted after the race. Right now, Naimi admired Silen more than just a little. After all, he had only flown 1 circuit, and Silen had flown 4. If a racer had to maintain this level of concentration in every circuit, then the racer was truly a capable person. In fact, Naimi suspected that the reason why there was a driver and a navigator was partly due to the fact that not everyone could drive from start to finish. This was a long-distance race, and those who didn't have the ability or tenacity to participate in it would only suffer even if they did. Naimi had participated in long-distance races before, but his competitiveness was limited, and the difficulties he encountered weren't too big. That was why he was able to persevere. But now that he was participating in the winds of freedom, he could only sigh. He needed more experience. In the past, Naimi and a bunch of noble children would drive their flying cars from one circuit to the next on the safe road. At the time, he thought that it was so easy. Isn't it just driving a flying car? Isn't it just a long-distance race? Bullshit. Naimi insisted on stopping his flying car at the repair point. After that, he sighed emotionally at Silen and told him his thoughts. It's fine, Silen. You do it. I'm not good enough yet. Silen thinks for a moment. Alright, I'll take over from here. Silen and the others weren't the only ones who went to the repair point for repairs. Almost every flying car that had completed the 5th circuit had to go to the repair point for repairs. The 6th circuit was an underwater circuit, and it would be suicide to fly into the sea if something happened to a flying car. The rescue team wouldn't be able to arrive in time every time, so it was better to be safe than sorry. The repair point was where Spearhead's motorcade was. Since the top 4 cars were leading the pack, the other cars were still lagging behind a little. Tobia and the others hadn't arrived yet when the flying car arrived at the repair point. The person in charge of Spearhead's repair point was busy ordering people to perform an emergency repair on their flying car. Inside the car, Dagny, the current captain of Spearhead, was chatting with his navigator teammate. Something's wrong with that Vegfritter. It's still fast, but it doesn't give me the same thrilling feeling, the navigator said. Dagny nodded in agreement. Indeed, it's like it's a completely different person. Suddenly, both of them recalled that the navigator of that flying car was Naimi of the Sizer family. Naimi was young, but he had participated in many flying car races. He might not have participated in a big race like the Winds of Freedom, but at the very least he had the experience. Piloting a flying car wasn't a problem at all. So you're saying that the young master of the Sizer family, Naimi, is that it? It should be him. But Danny, do you think the driver will change back to the kid who drove before in the next 2 most crucial stages? It's possible. No, it's very possible. He'll definitely switch back if he's not injured again. We need to work harder. That guy's just too crazy. Similar conversations were taking place in Arrow and Lightning's cars. Everyone was thinking about the switch at the same time. The last 2 circuits were the decisive sprint of the race. Let's go. The 4 flying cars arrived at the repair point at about the same time, and the maintenance time was almost the same. The only difference was that Naimi's car was a little behind the others, so he was a little behind when he was done with the repairs. But it was just a little. When the 4 flying cars left, there were still more flying cars that arrived one after another. This was the gap between the 4 of them. The cursor that drew the flight path extended diagonally from the cliff to the side and then disappeared into the sea. The 4 flying cars had already adjusted the parameters and relevant settings before entering the sea, so that the flying cars could move better in the sea. Vegfritter's scale-shaped propulsion system was also activated. However, it was in underwater mode right now, and its propeller had been switched to a different gear to greatly reduce the water's resistance. The most troublesome part of the journey was running into those big guys. Although they had cleaned up the area before the race, there was no telling if those big guys would come after them. Moreover, the flying cars weren't flying in the deep sea, so the chances of them running into those big guys weren't very high. Speaking of which, they had run into similar situations in the past. If they ran into those big guys in the sea, they couldn't fight them head-on. The only way to avoid them was to waste some time, and even if that time was very short, 1 second was more than enough for the flying car in front of them to leave them in the dust. The sea was beautiful. There weren't many industrial facilities on this planet, and there wasn't much man-made pollution. Coral reefs were everywhere, and all kinds of strange little fish and underwater animals looked very lively. The sea wasn't quiet at all. In fact, it was quite lively. Scylla didn't forget to look at the scenery in the sea while he was driving. For him, this kind of scenery always stirred up an uncontrollable emotion. Countless colorful underwater characters existed together, and the coral reefs looked like a carnival. It was rare for Scylla to see such a beautiful and natural living system. Swaying like a flower, or solid as a rock, the corals are the playground and home of these sea creatures. A giant sea turtle was swinging its front limbs leisurely, a giant grouper was swinging its tail clumsily and letting the little fish clean the parasites in its mouth, a goby and a bulldozer shrimp were working together, one as a bodyguard, the other as a cave builder, and they were sharing the same home. This was what Scylla saw. Every time he saw something like this, Scylla would always think back to the era when people talked about these things like myths on TV. After walking out of the planet, Scylla saw a lot of mythical scenes. They were all purely natural scenes, and not man-made or heavily made up with technology. However, there were some people who would never be able to see these things again. Naimi was shocked because Scylla had opened up 3 viewports. One was showing the situation at the front of the racetrack, one was showing the coral reefs not far away, and the last one was showing a wave pattern that he couldn't understand. It was exactly because Naimi had driven the car himself that he was so shocked right now. 3 viewports. Scylla, you can't do 3 things at once. Every time a flying car brushed past a big fish, Naimi's breathing would slow down a beat. Really? You really make people worry too much. While Scylla was driving, observing the underwater world and paying attention to the unusual waves, on the other side of the sea, the coast. As the waves rolled toward the beach, a figure emerged from the water and slowly walked up to the beach. The person was still covered in scales, and some of them were broken. Blue blood was still flowing out of the wounds that weren't serious, but they quickly scabbed over. After leaving the water, the person shook his arm and grabbed the thing he had taken out of the robot's head. The person walked up to the shore while cursing. The scales on his body gradually disappeared, and he looked more or less like a human. Fortunately, there was no one here, and no one would see this strange person walking naked on the beach. After looking around and making sure that there was no one around, the strange person took out a communicator out of nowhere. He didn't turn on the image projection, and only communicated with his voice. Hey, it's me, Sadia. I'm done here. Yeah, I know, no one noticed me. I know, I have to pay attention to my image, right? Do I look like that kind of person to run around naked? Don't push the blame on me for the immoral things. Yes, I took the best sample, I'll send it to you later. Sigh, it's nothing much, just a few cuts, deep to the bone, and a lot of blood. I'll definitely get a raise this time. I'm not lying, really. Didn't you notice that Hagrid is unusually blue today? This time, Scylla didn't notice any abnormal fluctuations in the machine language, so the sixth circuit went pretty smoothly. If you ignored the giant octopus they encountered in the middle of the circuit, and the giant school of fish that appeared out of nowhere during the second half of the circuit, which was most likely a group of sharks that had teased them together, then everything went pretty smoothly. When the veg fritter that looked like it had been injected with steroids charged out of the sea and ended the circuit, the people in the 3 flying cars behind it thought at the same time, as expected, that racer is back. Alright. This is the last circuit, Scylla. Let's do it. Naimi was so excited that he couldn't sit still. He was just a young man in his early 20s, so how could he keep his cool at a time like this? Naimi scratched his head when he saw that Scylla was still looking as dead as ever. Compared to him, Scylla looked like a much older person. They were obviously about the same age, so why was there such a huge difference between them? This time, he didn't stop. The flying car didn't need to go to the maintenance station for repairs, and Scylla already had a general idea of what to do with Black Viper's robot. He wasn't as worried and cautious as he was before, so he decided to end this quickly. Scylla opened all the scaly thrusters and moved his hands swiftly across the control panel. Naimi reflexively tightened his grip on his seat when he saw Scylla's reaction. His experience at the beginning of the circuit was so deep that it was no wonder he reacted like this. After thinking for a moment, Naimi stuffed a potion into his mouth for the first time since the start of the race. He had a feeling that it would be very embarrassing if he didn't do this. The reality was more or less the same as Naimi thought. The last circuit was filled with rocks, and crashing into a mountain wasn't like crashing into a sand dune. Crashing into a mountain was probably the end of the race. The closer they got to the end of the race, the more careful they had to be, or all their previous efforts would be for naught. The sky had turned dark again, and this made flying through the rocks even more difficult. Moreover, some of the light markers on the track would circle around the mountain, so the flying car would have to circle around the mountain a few times. If it wasn't handled properly, the best-case scenario would be crashing into a protruding part of the mountain, and the worst-case scenario would be crashing into the mountain and destroying both the driver and the car. The closer they got to the mountain, the shorter the flight path, and the greater the risk they had to bear. It was a technical job. That was why Naimi's heart almost jumped out of his throat every time he saw the flying car almost brush past the protruding mountain. Not only that, it kept happening again and again. Naimi checked the data again and discovered that the flying car was less than 5 millimeters away from the protruding mountain. There were plenty of people who could achieve this under normal circumstances, but this was a race. Moreover, Scylla's driving speed was as fast as he had been at the beginning of the circuit. Naimi felt like he was about to faint. He also felt nauseous. Was this the legendary car sickness? The Sizer family would definitely laugh their heads off if they found out about this. A member of the Sizer family actually got carsick? Bullshit, right? Naimi wasn't the only one who thought it was ridiculous. The other flying cars behind him were also in disbelief. Who would have thought that someone would be bold enough to fly through the last circuit at such a speed? Was he trying to sprint, or was he trying to die? Every time Scylla flew the flying car over a mountain, the people who stayed at the finishing point would celebrate once. Although it was already night time, the image on the giant screen had been processed. Every flying car was marked with an eye-catching fluorescent label, so everyone could see the silver fluorescent light that flashed by was the veg fritter. Zhen Xingming was yelling, "Charge harder," and "faster," at the top of his lungs. He didn't care if Scylla could hear him or not. The people around Zhen Xingming didn't care how many times Zhen Xingming yelled, "That's my bro," either. It was like a night of revelry. Brielle stared at the giant screen at the center of the circuit for a long time before letting out a low chuckle and shaking his head. The people around him didn't know what Brielle was thinking, but they all knew that Brielle, Naimi, and a kid had made a bet, and it looked like the antique veg fritter was going to win this race. If that was the case, Brielle would lose 100 million MB. 100 million, that was several years' worth of pocket money for them. If they lost, they would have to go begging. It was only natural that they would be in a bad mood after losing so much money. That was why no one dared to speak carelessly for fear that they'd run into the muzzle of a gun. Brielle suddenly rose to his feet, causing the people around him to shiver a little. But he didn't pay them any attention. Instead, he said to a servant beside him, "Prepare the money." "What about the general? I'll talk to him." "Yes, young master." Brielle waved the others away after he was done talking about the money. Then, he walked into his personal lounge and turned on his communicator. It didn't take long for the image of a person that both Sillin and Belle were very familiar with to appear on the communicator, Nahach Tosin. "What's wrong? Is there something you need me to clean up after you again?" Tosin looked a little travel-worn in his military uniform, but he looked very energetic. He had probably just returned from training or a mission. Brielle smiled and said, "I lost money today, brother." Tosin was very familiar with his younger brother's words by now. He asked carelessly while cleaning the dust off his clothes, "How much did you lose?" 100 million. That's not a lot." "How much?" Tosin crushed the cleaner in his hand with a crack, the veins on his forehead bulging. 100 million MB. Tosin sucked in a deep breath. "This won't do. I really want to kill that little bastard right now." Deep breaths, deep breaths, deep breaths. When he finally got his emotions under control, Tosin suppressed his anger and said, "Do you think our family does business like the Sizer family? You lost 100 million on a car race? Do you think 100 million is easy to earn? Do you know how much allowance I get from the military? Do you know how much I get even if I'm a dangerous person? Do you know?" Tosin suddenly realized that something was wrong after he said a series of, "Do you know your brother? Do you know our father? Do you know our family?" In the past, the little bastard would have cut him off impatiently with a wave of his hand, but today, something was very, very wrong. Tosin looked at his younger brother carefully. Although it was only a video, it was enough to see Brielle's abnormality clearly. "Are you being bullied?" Tosin asked tentatively. Money was money, and it could be earned back after it was spent. However, being bullied was not an option. It was a matter of a man's dignity. In his mother's words, it was a matter of a growing-up young man's mentality. Not to mention a young man whose mental development was already somewhat abnormal. Brielle shook his head and smiled. "No, I've just thought it through a little." He had always thought that his brother and father's refusal to let him drive a warship was just an excuse. Brielle's always thought that warships were warships, and flying cars were flying cars. How could they compare to a warship? A flying car was like a coward that could only stay on its own planet, and a warship was a hero. That was why Brielle had never had a good attitude toward flying cars. Even his attitude toward Naimi, a member of the Sizer family, was unpleasant. But now, after watching a race like this, Brielle felt like he had rediscovered something. He felt like time had stopped because of his own speed. It was like he had returned to the first time he saw a warship fly. It wasn't the flying car's fault, it was himself. If he continued to muddle along like this, he might end up like this for the rest of his life. He might end up watching others fly from the stands for the rest of his life. Far away at the 23rd MR, Tosin suddenly felt goosebumps all over his body. What did he just hear? Did his little bastard brother just say that he had thought it through? What the hell? Why, you're watching that flying car race right now, aren't you? Don't think too much, and don't do anything stupid. Just stay there and wait for me. Tosin clicked off the communicator and contacted the people around him immediately. They were the people his father had sent to protect Brielle, but they didn't learn anything important from them. Tosin told them to keep an eye on Brielle and not let him do anything stupid. After contacting the people around Brielle, Tosin immediately contacted his father at the imperial capital. The first thing he said was, "Dad, bad news." Brielle said he thought it through. "What? What happened to that kid?" "Send someone over to stop him from doing anything stupid." Brielle stared blankly at the disconnected communicator. Shouldn't he be happy that he had thought it through? Why was his brother looking at him like he was about to commit suicide? deafening cheers were already echoing from outside. Brielles turned off the communicator after checking the message he had received. He then summoned his servants and subordinates and left the cheering venue. No matter how loud the cheers were, the stage was always someone else's. If he couldn't walk out of someone else's stage and live under someone else's stage, he would never be able to take a step forward. Zhen Xingming stepped over the people in front of him the moment Silen's flying car crossed the finish line. In order to avoid the audience's excessive enthusiasm, Silen drove his flying car to a special parking lot. He saw Zhen Xingming running toward him excitedly the moment he stepped out of the door. Belle and Ulaganyuo were following closely behind him. Silen was about to greet them when he saw Sula's figure. Sula made a gesture and gestured for Silen to come over. Silen nodded and received the fist-like congratulations from Zhen Xingming and the others. After that, Silen excused himself and said that he had something to attend to. Zhen Xingming didn't give Silen a hard time after he saw Sula and the others waiting at the side. He let Silen pass for now. After Silen left, Zhen Xingming and the others turned their attention to Naimi, who was still in the car. "Hey, Naimi, come out and see what's going on. I can't calm the violent excitement in my blood even if I shout 3 times. Yeah, Naimi, come out now. Let's go party. Naimi, go receive your award, receive your award. Put on your shiny dress and go for a walk outside." Naimi looked up when he heard the chatter outside the car. His face was still a little pale, but he couldn't hide the excitement in his eyes. "I want to go party too, but my legs are numb after sitting in the car for so long. Let me catch my breath first. I'm not a robot like Silen." It wasn't that his legs were numb, but his legs were weak. However, Naimi couldn't say it out loud. The numbness in his scalp reminded him of the thrilling feeling of escaping from between the teeth of the devil in the stories. If he hadn't taken the medicine beforehand, he probably would have fainted already. On the other side, Sula led Silen to a room. "Black Viper's men did come here this time, and we've come to help you under orders. However, the one who truly helped you is your teacher, Guan Feng." Silen saw a couple of unfamiliar faces and 2 animals when he pushed open the door. Chapter 269. The first thing Silen saw when he pushed open the door was a white-haired man staring at the screen of a receiver in his hand. The receiver was playing the live stream of the race. A young man in tattered clothes was sleeping on a couch. Another young man was rocking his head back and forth while listening to some unknown song on his headphones. There was also a little girl who was completely absorbed in her game. All of them had one thing in common, and that was that they were minding their own business. They didn't even look at Silen's direction. A pack of snow-white wolves was lying on the other couch. They only twitched their ears once when Silen entered the room. The one who reacted the most was the armadillo lizard. Silen had an impression of it. Although it was only a brief glance, Silen was certain that it was the spiky ball he had seen in the desert. The armadillo lizard looked up when Silen entered the room. It wagged its tail and stared curiously at Silen. Silen had never seen this lineup before. Although he knew that they were from the affiliated schools, these people were very different from the ones he had seen in the past. Compared to the people Belle had brought to the bar with Dusk, the Soul Sentinel, they were much more imposing. However, in terms of threat level, they were definitely not as threatening as these people. Sula walked out of the room after bringing Silen into the room. It wasn't suitable for her to stay here because they were on different sides. If she stayed here, White Knight and the others wouldn't say a word. As expected, White Knight moved his gaze away from Silen after Sula walked out of the room. He seemed to be confirming the authenticity of his target, and not looking at a person. Once he was sure, White Knight took out a square object less than a quarter the size of his palm and placed it on the table. He pressed it a few times, and the square object unfolded just like the Vanguard ticket Silen used back then. It was a certificate. White Knight passed the unfolded certificate to Silen, and Silen accepted it. It stated very clearly that these people would help Silen take care of the robots that came looking for trouble, and that Silen should focus on the race. If the mission was completed successfully, there was a place for the recipient to sign and swipe the card. While Silen was reading the proof, Qilafeng, who was sleeping on a chair, suddenly stood up and said, "You'd better add a comment to this. Just say that we're not afraid of death, we're extraordinary, we've accomplished our mission beautifully, and we deserve a pay raise." Sadia had stopped listening to the music and moved closer to Qin Lai. Yes, you must state that we deserve a reward." Sadia had stopped listening to music and moved closer to Qin Lai. "Yes, we deserve a reward. You couldn't use any other pen on the certificate. You could only use your finger. There was a sensor in the certificate. You could just move your finger and sign it. If you wanted to leave a message, you could also write it with your finger." After signing his name, Silen wrote, "Worthy of reward," in the evaluation column. Qilafeng and Sadia were so happy they couldn't close their mouths. After he was done, Silen took out his affiliated school student ID and waved it at the card swipe area. A beep later, the ID came into effect. "It's done." Qilafeng took the certificate and shrank it back into its small form. He carefully put it away like a precious treasure. This was an important proof that he deserved a raise. "Since we're done here, it's time for us to go back. We'll talk again next time." Sadia patted Silen's shoulder before moving closer to Qilafeng and whispering something. Either way, the two of them were grinning like scoundrels. They were probably discussing how to spend the money after the raise. White Knight also rose to his feet. Before he left, he said to Silen, "Teacher Guan wants you to meet him at his house after you're done here." "All right. Thank you. No need." Without another word, White Knight, Qilafeng, and the others left with the two animals. They completely ignored Sula and the others who were standing outside. After White Knight and the others were gone, Silen asked Sula, "Are they the ones who stayed behind?" Most of the students in the affiliated schools would join different factions while they were still in school. They would have their own direction after they officially graduated, and some of them would be pulled into the RAS. Even the RAS's affiliated schools didn't completely belong to the RAS. Other than these people, there were also very few people who chose to stay behind instead of joining other factions. They had a fixed salary from the affiliated schools, and they had many ways to earn extra income. This incident was one of them. Sula nodded. "It is them. I didn't think that Teacher Guan would send them here. It looks like the situation is much more serious than we thought." Sula had a lot of questions about this matter that she couldn't get answers to even now. She couldn't get answers from the robots, and she couldn't get answers from White Knight and the others either. Not all the people who stayed behind were tight-lipped, but White Knight and the others were notoriously difficult to deal with. Even though they had graduated a few years ago, the instructors still couldn't help but curse them when they were mentioned. It was a love-hate relationship. Sula introduced White Knight and the others to Silen, and told him that Zhen Liao had sent them here. At first, they only received a small amount of information and weren't sure. That was why they were sent here just in case. Now it seemed that there were a lot of things that even Zhen Liao didn't know. Those robots seemed to have been upgraded again. The core protection of their brains was harder, and the robots were more cunning. They had all evaded the RAS's newest defense net and detectors, but the RAS was still one step too slow. Even now, Sula couldn't confirm how many robots were left on this planet. Judging from the robots' abilities, they definitely had a chance to take Silen away if their target was Silen. But why didn't they do anything? Why did they give her and White Knight more time to intervene? It was fine if she couldn't figure it out. After all, Sula was just an executor herself. She should leave the brainstorming to her superiors. Zhen Xingming was already urging Silen to go over. The awards ceremony was about to begin, and Silen had to go. "Please take care of things here as soon as possible. We will escort you and Her Highness back," Sula said. "All right." The venue for the awards ceremony was at the finishing line. It had already been set up and was brightly lit. Even though it was nighttime, the surroundings were as bright as day. When Silen arrived at the award venue, Jen Xingming hurriedly dragged him over. The first place team would be photographed together with their flying car, and they would also have to give a speech. Sillin pushed the job of giving a speech to Naimi. That guy was a talkative person anyway. This was a night of epical significance. From this night onward, Vegfritter was no longer the tragic character it used to be. After being buried for so many years, it finally stood at the center of attention once more, just like it did during its glory days. The audience in the main area were all cheering, but no one noticed that among the cheering audience, there was a burly man who was waving his arms and shouting with the people around him. His eyes flashed with light, just like the reflected light from the spotlights. At another part of the planet, a robot exited stealth mode and walked into an empty maintenance room. Things are over here. They've started moving as well. We don't need to expose ourselves any longer. We'll leave after they leave. Alright. Both Sillin and Naimi received a huge sum of money after winning the race. Coupled with the money Brielle sent over after he lost the bet, Sillin was basically a millionaire overnight. The second place of the race was Spearhead's wind-carrying car. The car behind it was a pretty good one, and it seized the opportunity to take second place after Arrow's shuttle-shaped car made a small mistake. Arrow's and Lightning's cars crossed the finish line almost at the same time, but it was only almost. Arrow's car made a small mistake at the end and lost the first 2 places, but it was still slightly ahead and won 3rd place. Tobia and Chiu Su didn't get into the top 10. This was only their first race, and it was a practice race. Their main goal was to familiarize themselves with the winds of freedom. Maybe they would be able to get a better ranking in the next race. What are you looking at? Tobia patted Chiu Su's shoulder before following her gaze. It was the place where the award ceremony was going to take place. Chiu Su's attention was drawn to the brightest stage at the moment. There was a Vegfritter flying car and the champion duo. Don't be discouraged, we're still young, and this is just our first race. We'll be able to stand there once we get used to this level of competition and work hard for the next race. 4 years will pass by in the blink of an eye. Tobia said. Chiu Su looked back and smiled, but didn't say anything. Tobia suddenly thought of something and pointed at Sillin with wide eyes. Don't tell me you've fallen for that kid. Don't get your hopes up. My brother said that he's pretty close to some noble kids, and you know who they are. Also, he might be even higher than the people who invested in our team. Don't make wild guesses, it's not like that. Alright. Let's go see our team's medal. Tobia relaxed after confirming that Chiu Su didn't mean it that way. After all, their team didn't want to provoke too many nobles. They would only end up as cannon fodder in a fight between nobles. Chiu Su followed Tobia back to the team, but the emotions in her eyes were unclear. Suddenly, she moved her gaze to a certain part of the spectator stand. The brawny man who was waving his arms froze for an instant, but he quickly recovered. So troublesome. Chiu Su sighed quietly. No one heard Chiu Su's sigh because it was too noisy around them. Naimi was giving his acceptance speech due to excessive excitement during a series of dazzling award ceremonies. The flying car that everyone thinks is trash is the Vegfritter. We didn't do well in this race, and all we did was fly a little more happily than the others. Our results weren't good, and all we got was a championship. Some of the people on the stands behind him wanted to slap him with their shoes when he said that. When the ceremony was finally over, Sillin was dragged to the post-race cocktail party by Jen Xingming. A bunch of people passed out from drinking too much and collapsed on the ground. Everyone was taken away by their respective teams. Sillin grabbed Jen Xingming by the arm while the Sizer family escorted the deliriously drunk Naimi, Oleganuo, and Kenancy to the Sizer family's lounge. When they came out, Sillin saw the people from Spearhead walking out of the party hall. Their gazes met Chiu Su's, and both of them looked away. However, Sillin was already starting to feel puzzled. Ever since he saw Chiu Su at the repair shop before the race, Sillin had a feeling that she wasn't a simple girl. At the time, Sillin thought that she would definitely get a good ranking if she was the one driving the flying car. At the very least, she would be in the top 10. But later he realized that Chiu Su was just a navigator, and their team didn't get any good results. Why was she hiding her strength? Sillin didn't understand. Moreover, when he met Chiu Su's gaze just now, Sillin had a strange feeling that the girl must know something. But that was it. Now wasn't the time for Sillin to look into Chiu Su's information. The next day, Sillin turned down Naimi and Fleeka's attempts to persuade him to stay and dragged the disgruntled Jen Xingming and Sula's group back to the Jen family. On the way back, Sillin checked Chiu Su's file and found a lot of fake traces. Most people wouldn't notice these traces, so the person who made them must be very skilled in this field. There was no tampering at all. Every piece of information could be proven in various ways, but when Sillin analyzed it logically and probabilistically, he discovered something strange. One strange point could be said to be a coincidence, but several strange points couldn't be right. It could only be said that her information was forged. What kind of person could forge her information to this extent? They didn't look like Black Viper, but Sillin had a feeling that there was some kind of connection between them. It was Sillin's intuition. An intuition without any proof. Sillin had been thinking about Black Viper and Chiu Su all along the way. He didn't succeed in contacting Guan Feng either. Guan Feng had set up the auto-response system to reply to him every time. He didn't know what he was doing, but he heard that the Purgatory Thunder Snake S-class was almost done. He was probably still working on it. When Sillin walked into Jenya's courtyard, he immediately saw the big guy inside. He couldn't help but notice it because it was just too eye-catching. That's the egg. Sillin pointed at the 50-meter-long guy in the courtyard. Right now, the big guy's mouth was open, and Hui Mao was ordering the servants to brush its tongue and teeth. The servants seemed to have gotten used to it by now. They weren't afraid of standing in the big guy's mouth and brushing its teeth. They even talked to it while brushing its teeth. Seeing that Sillin had returned, Hui Mao ran over with a smug catwalk and showed off, "Look, my pet. What do you think?" Sillin looked at the big fellow whose mouth was open but eyes were rolling in their direction and said, "This guy's appetite is pretty big, isn't it? Otherwise, how could he grow so crazily as if he was injected with hormones?" "It is, but second grandpa said it's nothing." Hui Mao flicked his ears and said, "Second grandpa? How dare you call him that?" "Oh right, I've thought of a new name for it, blue skin. It's because its skin is blue." Hui Mao jumped onto Sillin's shoulder and asked urgently, "What do you think of the name?" "I guess I'll just have to make do with it for now." Poor Blue Skin's name was made do, just like that. Sillin explained the general situation of the flying car race to Jenya. He had covered most of the small details, but he was sure that Jenya knew more or less about Sula's movements. That was why Sillin avoided the important details and focused on the trivial ones. "What? There's a prize? How much?" Hui Mao's eyes shone brightly as he slapped Sillin with his paw. Sillin ignored Hui Mao's paw and pinched the back of its neck. He told Jenya that he was going back to his room to rest and left the yard, leaving Blue Skin to play with the servants who were brushing their teeth. "Any news?" Sillin asked Hui Mao after he returned to his room. "No, we didn't get much useful information here. The Jen family didn't find anything either, but one thing is for sure. Those robots are definitely doing something." Sillin fell silent for a moment. "Come with me to meet Teacher Guan tomorrow." "For what?" Hui Mao wasn't very willing. "I have business with him." "Don't go if you don't want to." "Then let's go. We've stayed here long enough. It's time to go for a walk." In reality, Hui Mao was only concerned about the money in Sillin's pocket. He could also buy some fish biscuits on the way. "Alright, let's go to AF1 tomorrow. I'll go make some arrangements first." He still had to tell the servants to feed the pets on time. Jenya didn't say anything about Sillin leaving as soon as he came back. There was still work to be done at the affiliated school, and Sillin couldn't stay here forever. Blue Skin was very reluctant to part with Hui Mao, but Hui Mao became much more obedient after giving it a few paws. Be a good boy and stay at home. We'll bring you some food when we come back, said Sillin. Blue Skin, meow, Sillin. Slapping Blue Skin's head, Sillin said, you're a sea beast, not a cat. Sillin brought the gray cat with him to AF1. The Zhen family was there to escort him there. As for Zhen Xingming and the others, they were still skipping classes. They wouldn't go to the affiliated school to listen to the teachers even if they were bored. It hadn't been long since he left AF1, but Sillin's feelings were noticeably different after he returned. Maybe it was because he had vented some of his frustrations, or maybe it was because he felt a lot more relaxed after experiencing the extreme speed of the flying car race. Most people who came to AF1 for the first time would think that the pace of life here was fast and busy. But Sillin didn't feel nervous at all. He didn't feel nervous at all. He was a lot more nervous than he was during a race. He drove the flying car to Guan Feng's house at the school's speed limit and parked in the yard. Sillin felt that something was wrong the moment he entered the yard. It was the same scenery as before, but there wasn't any sign of human presence. Was Guan Feng still at the research lab? Didn't White Knight tell him to look for him at Guan Feng's house? The door opened on its own after Sillin swiped his student ID, and Sillin walked inside. The house was empty, and the fish in the fish tank were still swimming happily. However, the whole house gave Sillin a very strange feeling. Chapter 270. Guan Feng liked to cook his own food, so there were a couple of kitchens in his house. But judging from the state of the kitchens, all the machines had stopped working. The housework robot stood quietly in a corner and didn't react to Sillin's arrival at all. Not even its indicator light flashed. He turned on one of the baking machines and found a half-baked Guan family special biscuit inside. The furnishings in the other places were all fine, just as he remembered. There was no mess, no traces of fighting. Sillin went upstairs to take a look. Guan Feng's bedroom, study, and so on were all tightly shut, and there was a password set in place that prevented anyone from opening them. There were no signs of someone breaking in either. It was almost as if Guan Feng had vanished into thin air. When he returned to the living room downstairs, Hui Mao was jumping out of the fish tank with a fish in his mouth. He stepped on the fish's body with his claws and tore it open from head to tail. There was no flesh or blood. It was a mechanical fish. You want to fool me? No way. Hui Mao swallowed the entire mechanical fish and looked at Sillin. Where's Guan Feng? Sillin shook his head. I don't see him. His gaze fell to the sofa. There was a projector on the table in front of the sofa with a flickering indicator light. Sillin pressed a button, and the lights in the living room were turned off. The curtains on the windows were drawn shut on their own. The living room was plunged into darkness. A human figure appeared on the sofa. It was an ordinary-looking person who wouldn't stand out in a crowd, but Sillin knew that it was a robot. As for why he could tell it was a robot from a projection, Sillin could only say that it was intuition. Dear visitor, we are sorry that the owner of this place is unable to receive you. Our boss only invited him over to reminisce about old times. We do not know when he will return. If you are in a hurry, you may come to this place. A gigantic star map appeared behind the voice. The planets around it were lined up neatly, and it was possible to see the 20 or so star regions of the Empire clearly. Among these planets, there was one that shone especially brightly, and that was the planet the robot was talking about. However, if Sillin remembered correctly, this planet wasn't part of the star map he had obtained before. The star chart lasted for 5 seconds before disappearing. The robot sitting on the sofa also disappeared. The curtains opened again, the lights turned on, and the living room returned to its original state. Although the star chart had only appeared for 5 seconds, Sillin had already memorized it. After the preset projector was turned off, Sillin dimmed the lights in the living room once more and took out the star chart in his hand. Comparing it with the star map provided by the robot, it could be seen that the star map in Sillin's hands did not contain the one that had just been marked. There were a few other planets and a star in the area that weren't on the star map. However, all the other planets were pretty much the same. From the star map, it could be seen that gravity was pulling all the planets in the area toward the spot where the star had disappeared. This meant that there was probably a star there. The gravity image was still there, but the planets at the center of the area had disappeared. This area was just an inconspicuous corner of the mist Bodhisattva Empire. No one paid attention to it, and no one bothered to look into its secrets. Of course, it was possible that someone had discovered it but failed to find the answer, or that the planet had disappeared while they were searching for the answer. Most of the people in the Mist Bodhisattva Empire who possessed a star map of the entire empire had the exact same star map as the one in Silen's possession. There was no planet marked on the map at all. This meant that someone had erased all the records and star map traces of this planet and every planet around it. Only the Mist Bodhisattva Empire's upper echelons were capable of such a thing. But who was it? Why would they do such a thing? Was it Black Viper's spy? Silen didn't know, and he couldn't guess. He knew too little about the Mist Bodhisattva Empire. Right now, Silen wasn't involved in the games between the upper echelons and the secret squabbles, and he didn't want to get involved either. However, Guan Feng's incident had given Silen another idea. Silen sat on the sofa and thought quietly. Hui Mao didn't disturb him, so he strolled around the living room out of boredom before sneaking into Guan Feng's kitchen to eat some biscuits. Not long later. Oh my meow. Silen's thoughts were interrupted by a strange, muffled sound that sounded like a cat being locked in a jar. What's wrong with you now? Exasperated, Silen got up and went to the kitchen. The first thing he saw when he entered was a furry but wagging its tail. Hui Mao had stuck his head into a biscuit-making machine and was trying his best to pull it out. You're stuck. Silen walked over and helped him pull it out. Hey, wait, don't pull it, I'm stuck. Hui Mao yelled from inside. Can't you transform into another form? Just as Silen was speaking, he was stopped by a click that came from inside. Then, a few more clicks followed. After a couple more cracking sounds, Hui Mao finally came out with a face full of green biscuit crumbs and a round cylinder. This is the best I can take out. There's another box inside, so I can't take it out. Hui Mao licked his paws and wiped his face. There was another world under the biscuit-making machine. Hui Mao had discovered that there was something under the biscuit-making machine while he was eating, so he bit through the biscuit-making machine and tried to take out what was inside. Who knew that it would be so hard to take out? Silen held the small cylinder and gave it a look. He didn't know what was inside, and it would take some effort to open the cylinder. Right now, Silen didn't deal with the cylinder immediately. Instead, he looked through the broken bottom of the biscuit machine and looked at the box he hadn't taken out yet. Although it wasn't good to destroy something like this without Guan Feng's permission, they were in a critical situation right now. Silen took out his tools and dismantled the composite kitchenware. Then, he took out the box inside. Just like the cylinder, the box was protected with a password and couldn't be opened immediately. What's inside? Silen looked at Hui Mao. I don't know. The outer shell is made of a special material, so I can't see what's inside. Hui Mao bit into another biscuit. You might get diarrhea if you eat these half-raw biscuits. I won't. It's not like I haven't eaten them before. Up to you. Come over and decipher the password when you're full. Silen picked up his tools again and reassembled the disassembled kitchenware. After eating the biscuit, Hui Mao cooperated with him and started deciphering the two items' passwords. He deciphered the cylinder first, and when he was done, the front of the cylinder opened up to reveal a blueprint. It was the blueprint of the Purgatory Thunder Snake S. I think I've seen something secret. Silen could more or less guess what was inside the box after he stuffed the blueprint back into the cylinder. Just as Silen expected, the box contained the Purgatory Thunder Snake S. The white body of the spear made people feel a sense of coldness, pure and cold. The muzzle of the gun was hexagonal. Silen thinks that it was a snowflake. There was a Purgatory Thunder Snake insignia and an S symbol on the gun. Guan Feng actually designed it in such a short time. Guan Feng was the only person who could put such a precious gun under the biscuit machine in the kitchen. Of course, no one would have thought that Guan Feng would leave the priceless Purgatory Thunder Snake S in a place like this. However, this also made Sillin realize a problem. Guan Feng didn't even take the Purgatory Thunder Snake S with him. Did he leave in a hurry? Or did he not have a chance? Or did he not want Black Viper to know about this at all? Sillin put away the cylinder and box and sat down on the sofa in the living room. What should he do next? Hui Mao rubbed his belly on the sofa and yawned in boredom. Suddenly, his ears twitched and he looked outside the door. Beep, the door opened, and a person walked in. It was a familiar face. Sillin had seen him not long ago. White Knight. Sillin looked at White Knight in puzzlement. Guan Feng must have set up an entry requirement for this place. Sillin was allowed in because he was Guan Feng's student, but what about White Knight? How did he get in? White Knight wasn't surprised to see Sillin here. He looked around before staying on top of the fish tank. One of the fish was missing. There was a mechanical fish inside. It's been taken care of, Sillin explained. I know. I've been here before, but I didn't take care of it. White Knight walked over to the sofa and sat down. Snow Wolf Rubu followed him into the room. The wolf and cat immediately faced off against each other the moment they entered the room. Hui Mao had just rubbed his belly on the sofa, leaving only the small sofa on the opposite side untouched. White Knight had already sat down on the small sofa. Rubu wanted to lie down on the sofa, but the cat smell irritated him the moment he smelled it. It was as if this place already belonged to someone. Hui Mao didn't feel embarrassed at all. He didn't move away from the sofa and looked provocatively at Rubu while wagging his tail. Rubu bared his teeth. Hui Mao flicked his ears and ignored him. Have you read the information inside? Sillin pointed at the projector on the table and asked White Knight. Yep. Sillin raised an eyebrow. He's this calm. Right now, Sillin was really suspicious. Just who was this for? Was it for Sillin himself, or for White Knight? What are you going to do? White Knight asked. Sillin knocked his forehead. I guess I'll go take a look. What about you? I'll go. Because of Guan Feng? Because I'm bored. Sillin. It was true that Sillin wouldn't be able to handle Black Viper alone, but Sillin didn't want to ask the Gen family for help right now. Sillin didn't want to get too close to the Gen family other than Genya, and if he were to ask someone to go with him, would it be this guy? It was at this moment White Knight's communicator rang. What is it? White Knight answered the call and asked. Did you find him? I need money urgently. Sadia yelled from the other side. No, but I've got news. Sillin looked at White Knight. Was he going to leak Guan Feng's whereabouts? Where is he? Is Teacher Guan hiding somewhere? He can't owe us our wages even if he's Teacher Guan. Come here first. Tell Chi Lafang and Nikki to come with me. We have work to do. Wait here, I'll be right there. After White Knight ended the call, Sillin asked him, are you going to announce it to the public? No, it's just that it's suicide to go to Black Viper's place with just the two of us. Sillin thought for a moment and agreed that it was fine. White Knight and the others weren't too deeply involved with the other forces of the Empire anyway. They were on the free side, and it would be convenient for them to act this way without triggering a chain reaction. Sadia and the others showed up very quickly. It was probably because they didn't get their money back due to Guan Feng's disappearance that they were full of resentment. You're the cat that made Dar cry. The lizard armadillo stared at Hui Mao who was lying on the sofa and wagging his tail lazily. Who are you? Hui Mao countered with a question. Armadillo crawled over with a chuckle and introduced himself and the snow wolf Rubel. Rubel ignored Hui Mao just as arrogantly as before. Hui Mao couldn't be bothered to deal with the big dog either. His attention was drawn to something else. Hui Mao twitched his nose and looked at Sadia, who was sitting carelessly on the sofa next to him. What are you looking at? Sadia tried to pinch Hui Mao's ear, but Hui Mao scratched him away. You smell like fish. Fish? Sadia sniffed again. No, I didn't eat fish today. Hui Mao wagged his tail. I know, you're a mutant. A mutant from the sea. This time, White Knight and the others were surprised as well. They didn't expect this cat to be able to sniff out something like that. Sadia's teeth had turned into rows of sharp fangs when he grinned. I'm a mutant from the sea. What do you want from me? Hui Mao yawned. What's so special about that? Stop being so cocky. Sadia. Hui Mao jumped onto Silen's shoulder. Are these guys coming with us to find Guanfeng, Silen? Sadia started yelling before Silen could answer. What's wrong with Guanfeng? Does he owe you his salary as well? White Knight briefly explained the situation to Sadia before turning off the projector and replaying the scene. I see. I happen to be a bit free lately, so I can take a look around. But I'll have to ask Guanfeng for a raise. Sigh, White Knight, if Guanfeng goes back on his word, you'll have to pay him instead. He's your teacher after all, Sadia said. Guanfeng is White Knight's teacher. Direct teacher. Silen really didn't know about this. So it made sense that White Knight was able to enter Guanfeng's house. In fact, Pastura had to call White Knight, senior brother, in front of him. That being said, White Knight didn't demand that of Silen. He didn't care if he called him that or not, and he didn't even care about Goryo. The preset projector on the table had played it once when White Knight had arrived, and then played it a second time when Silen had come in. After the third time, the preset projector was completely destroyed, and all the records inside were destroyed. Moreover, the star map image on it could not be copied at all. Interesting. I didn't expect Black Viper to be hiding in such a small corner. Qi Lafang, who hadn't said much until now, suddenly spoke up. White Knight didn't answer. He looked at Silen instead. We'll be going together. What's your plan? Do you want to join us? Of course. I'd be courting death if I went alone, Silen said. Hui Mao rose to his feet. Me too. I'm going to teach those trash robots a lesson this time. Silen could tell that White Knight and the others worked together quite often, and they knew a lot about the Empire. It would be a lot safer for Silen to go with them. We'll kick you out anytime if you're a burden, Nikki said. No problem. White Knight and Silen opened Guanfeng's warehouse with their IDs and took out some equipment and resources. At the same time, they brought out a high-quality flying machine. Silen guessed that White Knight had been doing this for a long time, judging from how familiar he looked with the place. Speaking of which, it seemed that all of Guanfeng's direct students were more or less the same. They took Guanfeng's things with ease. Since they were going to Black Viper's territory, it was only natural that they would be away for a longer period of time. During this time, one of Silen's courses was going to be tested. If he didn't take the test, he would fail the course. Guanfeng would never allow something like that to happen, and Silen couldn't bring himself to fail the very first course. Therefore, he had to talk to the instructor before he left. Silen had read through the reference materials Guanfeng had given him several times already, and there was no way he would fail the course if he took the test. Therefore, Silen was going to apply to take the test early. The instructor was quite old, and it was rumored that he was as experienced as Guanfeng in the affiliated schools. His hair was white, and although his face was covered in wrinkles, they weren't as deep as a normal old man's. Maybe it was because he often attended classes, but his voice was loud and full of energy. The old man was very angry when he heard that Silen was going to take the test early. I don't care how many things you have to do or what your background is. You're a student first and foremost, and a student should prioritize their studies. Students of AF1 shouldn't compete with those good-for-nothings of AF3 in terms of who lives a leisurely life. Silen couldn't help but sigh with emotion at the instructor's words. As expected of an experienced teacher who had taught for so many years. He didn't even pause when he started talking, and his words were righteous. As an experienced educator and one of the few academicians of the Royal Academy of Sciences who had given more than 100 lectures, he never ran out of things to say. After enduring the old teacher's scolding that lasted for 2 hours without a single pause or repetition, Silen finally got his wish to take the early test. The old teacher supervised the entire process to prevent Silen from committing any fraud. Moreover, the difficulty of the pre-test questions was on the high side, but it was still acceptable to Silen. He completed the questions without a hitch, and only one extended question took up a bit of time. The old instructor gave Silen a mental score every time he tried to answer a question. When Silen was done with the question, his total score was out as well. He didn't give Silen any face at all. After a snort, he waved his hand and dismissed Silen. He passed the test, didn't he? Silen left the old instructor's place after he was done with this big problem. After Silen left, the discontent on the old instructor's face turned into helplessness. What a troublesome matter. What the hell are you guys doing? There's nothing we can do about it. A young man walked out of one of the rooms in the old instructor's house. Do whatever you want. I'm too old to get involved. The old instructor walked toward the study with Silen's test questions in hand. When he passed by the young man, he paused for a moment and said, "Don't go too far." "I know, don't worry." Chapter 271. Silen and White Knight departed immediately after they were done with the business at AF1. They didn't tell Genya about this because it would drag the Gen family into this mess. Right now, Silen had no idea how many people were involved in this mess or how many higher-ups were involved in this mess. Silen didn't know how many higher-ups of the Empire were involved in this mess at all. It was as if a drop of ink had fallen into a pool of water and melted into it. Although the water didn't look much different from before, the drop of ink did exist in the water. Although the star map inside the projector in Guan Feng's living room couldn't be duplicated and the projector had self-destructed on its own, everyone had a good memory. They were able to recreate a new star map after the projector had self-destructed. Is there really such a place? Inside the spaceplane's control room, Sadia asked Silen while staring at the partial star map projection in his hand. There should be. Even if there aren't any of those planets, there must be other planets in that place, Silen said. You're right. I never noticed this place on my previous star map. How mysterious it is. Sadia poked at the marked spot with his finger. I wonder what's waiting for us there. Qi Lafeng twirled his sun hat with his finger. Whatever it is, it's going to be troublesome. Oh right, I heard that Black Viper has a lot of robots. I wonder what level they're at right now. I'd be very disappointed if they're still the same as the scrap metal we ran into a while ago. Nikki, who was playing a game, shot him a sideways glance. Even if you're a pile of scrap metal, 1,000 of them will be able to turn you into a sieve with a single shot, not to mention that you're in Black Viper's headquarters. Write a will first, and when the time comes, divide up your remaining assets. Qi Lafeng paused in twirling his sun hat and chuckled. I'm not willing to throw my life away for the unspent assets I haven't spent yet. Then be serious and don't screw up when the time comes. A man who can fall asleep in shooting class is seriously suspicious. Also, don't think I don't know that Armadillo was the one who completed most of the last mission. Shooting class is so boring, it would be strange if I didn't fall asleep. Secondly, you can't deny the fruits of my labor. I've also fought robots before. Nikki ignored Qi Lafeng's nonsense and continued playing her game. Armadillo wagged his tail. This wasn't the first time Qi Lafeng had fallen asleep during a battle. Hey, where are those two? Qi Lafeng kicked Armadillo. Armadillo pointed at the door with his tail. They're patrolling their territory. Ever since they boarded the aircraft, Hui Mao and Rubel, the two guys who loved to enclose territories, started to fight for territory. The spaceplane wouldn't allow them to spray their metabolites anywhere they wanted, so Whis habitually rubbed its own scent everywhere. Rubel the snow wolf did the same, and the two fellows immediately started fighting over territory the moment they boarded the spaceplane. They nearly broke into a fight. In the end, Huimao came out on top and seized more territory. Rubel was afraid that the cat would cheat him, so every time Huimao went out to patrol his territory, Rubel would go out and supervise him to prevent the cat from taking over his territory. As they were talking, Huimao walked in with his tail up, followed by Rubel, who had an ugly expression on his face. "Yo, are you done patrolling?" Armadillo greeted them. Rubel was annoyed at the mention of this. If this cat wasn't a team member's pet, I would have bitten it to death. Huimao jumped onto Silen's shoulder and was licking his paws. When he heard Rubel's words, he raised his paw and pointed at Rubel. "You know how many times I've eaten trash like you when I was a kid?" Silen smiled as he recalled the first time he met Huimao. This guy had indeed eaten a lot of wolves. He flicked Huimao's ear. "Alright, don't argue. We're all teammates this time." Huimao snorted. "We're both canines, but this guy is annoying no matter how I look at him. Chifeng is better." Rubel bared his teeth. If the cat said one more word, he would go over and bite off the cat's ear. Just as Huimao was about to say something, an alarm interrupted him. "What's wrong?" The sleepy Qi Lafang woke up with a start. "Nothing, I just received a message." Nikki put down the game console and converted the received signal into characters. After decoding it, it was a message: "If you want to find Black Viper, come here first, or you'll regret it." The people in the control room looked at the message in silence. Nikki continued to decode the message. Along with the message was a simple star map with a planet indicated on it. It wasn't the area that had disappeared, but a place slightly further away from that area. However, the similarity between all of them was that they hadn't forgotten about that planet. Even though everyone could find that planet on their star maps, no one paid attention to it. Moreover, there was very little information about that planet. In short, it could be summed up in one word: poor. After a while, Silen asked White Knight, "Has our whereabouts been leaked?" White Knight shook his head. "No one knows where we're going except for the few of us." If it wasn't Black Viper, and no information had been leaked, then who had sent this encrypted message? There was no doubt that the person who had sent this message was very familiar with Silen's group's whereabouts and goals. However, none of them could think of anyone who would do such a thing. "What do we do? Are we going?" Sidia looked at everyone. "Same old rules, let's vote." Nikki moved her finger, and a screen appeared in front of everyone. There were 3 choices on it: go, no, and forfeit. The final choice was go. Looks like we all have the same idea. That's a good thing. Sidia smiled. Since they had decided to go, they adjusted their flight path and flew toward that planet. Everyone had been searching for information about that planet before they arrived, but the strange thing was that the results were all the same. However, the information was also quite limited, which made it even stranger. Even with their capabilities, they could only find so little information, and they weren't even sure if this information was real or not. Even the poorest planet, even if it's so barren that it can't support itself, the database should have records about it. However, there's just too little information. "It's as if someone has erased all the other information," Nikki said. Her young face, which looked like she was 7 or 8 years old, was filled with a serious and contradictory expression. If Silen didn't already know that she was in her 30s, he would have thought that she had the same special experience as Tang Qiuqiu. "No matter what, we need to be careful. Bring your equipment." While everyone was discussing a strategy, Rubu and Armadillo also joined in the discussion with serious expressions on their faces. Huimao was the most relaxed in the control room. It didn't care about the strangeness of that planet at all. To it, this was just a hunting game. Not only was it not nervous, but it was also looking forward to it. It would be best if there was some fresh food to satisfy its hungry stomach. Silen and Blueskin had already divided up all the sea beast eggs they had collected, and now they were very hungry. Scylla and the others found their destination planet based on the coordinates given by the message. The planet wasn't big, and the environment wasn't good. Although humans could survive on the planet, it definitely wasn't a good life. According to the scanning area of the probe, this was indeed a relatively barren planet. There weren't even any surveillance satellites or defense networks on the planet's periphery. It was obvious that the development of this planet wasn't good. "What's the situation on the planet?" Armadillo asked. "Very poor." He was as poor as a doornail. Apart from the metal content in the city areas, the other places have pitifully little metal content. The soil is gray, and gray soil is lacking in many elements. There are very few plants that can survive in this kind of soil. There are less than 100 species of plants that have evolved to adapt to the soil, but each of them is very strong. "It's survival of the fittest," Nikki explained. Looking at the planet from space, most of it was gray, and it looked very depressed and lifeless. From the image shown on the monitor, they could see what was happening on the bright side of the planet. The reason why almost all the metals on the planet were concentrated in the cities was that they were almost metal cities made of steel. Rather than calling them cities, it was better to call them large fortresses, as if they were guarding against something. Finally, they saw what the cities were guarding against. Not far from the cities, there were many black shadows moving very quickly. They were the animals that had adapted to the planet. They were about 3 meters tall and had long claws that could dig through the gray soil to find small animals hiding underground. They could also use their sharp claws to attack humans. Humans were also part of their diet. There were many places on the planet that had these black monsters moving very quickly. "Say, what do you think that mysterious person wants us to do here?" "Help clear out the monsters," Qi Lafang said as he lay on the chair with his arms crossed, looking at the image on the screen. Bai didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Nikki and asked, "Is there anything else besides that message and the star map?" Nikki shook her head. "Nothing else. That's what I'm curious about." Just then, the receiver received another message, and Nikki quickly decoded it. "Welcome to this place." Sadia read out the decoded message and looked at Nikki in confusion. "And then? There's nothing else." Nikki was also very helpless. Was the other party messing with them with just this bit of information? Nikki rubbed her ears. She liked to rub her ears whenever she was annoyed. She continued, "Since that person has the technology to send us this message, the situation on this planet shouldn't be like this." Indeed. The backwardness of this planet is too far away from the technology that person possesses. "Can't find the source of the message?" Bai Yi asked Nikki. "No. That person is very cunning. Almost every city on this planet has traces of his signal. So he's an expert. Is he really not from the Black Viper?" Qi Lafang said as he rubbed his chin. His eyes were so narrow that it was impossible to see the expression in them. They didn't say anything, and neither did they immediately land on the planet. Instead, they waited outside the planet. Sillin looked at Hui Mao on his shoulder. Even though the cat was trying its best to act as if nothing had happened, Sillin could tell from the frequency at which its whiskers were twitching and the curve of its tail that it was wagging. What was it proud of? There was only one answer. "You know where the source is?" Sillin pinched Hui Mao's ears. Hui Mao's ears twitched and flicked Sillin's hand away, but it didn't say anything. Did that mean it was tacit agreement? Everyone in the control room and the animals looked at Hui Mao. This time, Hui Mao couldn't keep up his act any longer, and his mouth opened uncontrollably. How did it know? Rub was very reluctant to believe it. White Knight unfurled the scanned map of the planet and placed it in front of Hui Mao. "You know where he is?" Hui Mao raised a paw and pointed at one of the cities proudly. "I only know that he's in this city, but I don't know which corner of the city he's in. But if he emits one more time, I'll be able to find him and catch this hidden rat." White Knight looked at Sillin, and Sillin nodded, indicating that he was trustworthy. "Go to that city," White Knight said to Nikki. "Okay." Nikki piloted the aircraft and flew in that direction. Rub's eyes widened. You believe it just like that? You believe this cat? There was a metal electric fence in the sky above the city to prevent dangerous birds from entering. There were also people who would keep an eye on them. From time to time, a few simple flying cars would fly out. These cars were very cumbersome, but they were very practical in this kind of environment. Although they weren't very agile, they had good defense and could withstand the attacks of some flying birds. There were also a few teams of people who drove armored land vehicles out to hunt. There was a lack of meat in the city. Man and beast, this was a two-way process of hunting. Both sides were on the other's menu. The people in the metal cities were generally stronger. Be it men or women, or even children, they all had a murderous look in their eyes. Different places nurtured different people. Their living environment shaped these people's personalities. Just like Tang Qiuqiu, these children had been armed with guns and knives since they were young. They learned how to fight against monsters from their elders, and it was a necessary lesson for them in life. Silen's group didn't want to be too high-profile. They didn't want to expose too much before they figured out the situation. However, every metal city was an independent entity, and they all rejected outsiders. In the end, they didn't go straight into the city. Instead, they found a place to settle down and figure out the situation on this planet. Otherwise, they would be caught like turtles in a jar if they recklessly entered the city. At night, the aircraft quietly landed at the predetermined location. The place was covered by a hill, and the aircraft landed in stealth mode, so no one noticed them. Although no one noticed them, the monsters were unusually perceptive. Those guys outside are pretty fast, Sadia said as he looked at the scene on the screen. I'm going to look for food. Hui Mao jumped off Silen's shoulder and ran out. I'm going too. Rub didn't want to be left behind and ran out. I'm going out too. I'm hungry. Armadillo wagged his tail and followed. Chapter 272. Armadillo wasn't really hungry, but he was worried that the two of them would fight after they got out. If both of them got injured, it would be fine. After all, the two of them had strong regenerative abilities. The most important thing was that they couldn't expose themselves. They hadn't figured out who the person who sent the message was, and if there were any traps, so they couldn't be too reckless. The sky gradually brightened. On the hillside, the whole mountain looked gray. Some of the plants that grew on it had a depressing hue. There were also some white plants, but not many of them. Next to the gray forest, Rubu was tearing a clawed beast apart. It didn't have to do this, but Rubu was in a bad mood, so this prey that he just caught became his target to vent his anger. From the hillside, a few black dots could be seen moving on the ground in the distance, and these black dots were decreasing rapidly. Those black dots were the common black-clawed beasts on this planet, and the reason why they were decreasing was simple. A cat was eating them to fill its stomach. The gray cat and the gray land didn't look conspicuous at all. It was like a natural camouflage, so it didn't stand out from afar. Ordinary people wouldn't be able to see what was happening without the help of tools, but Rubel and Armadillo weren't humans. Their vision was very good, and even without tools, they could see everything clearly without missing a single detail. It was a small cat, but when the black-clawed beasts pounced on it, its mouth suddenly widened and swallowed the black-clawed beasts. Then, the second one, the third one, these clawed beasts were also intelligent. They knew that this inconspicuous animal was not easy to deal with, so they started to run away. Hui Mao chased after them, and with its speed, only a few clawed beasts could escape. No wonder Dar cried when he was bitten by that cat. If that cat really ate as much as it wanted, Dar's little crocodile would easily become its meal. But how big is that cat's stomach? Armadillo slowly crawled over and looked at Hui Mao and said to Rubu. Armadillo could tell from Hui Mao's movements that Hui Mao was quite strong. Not to mention its speed, just its hunting speed was something that Armadillo could not achieve. He didn't even need to bite the cat and directly swallowed it. He wasn't like Bonner, the big snake. Besides, This cat was swallowed whole. If it were to be compared to the group of beasts in AF1, it would definitely be ranked among them. Rubu gnawed on the bones of the sharp-clawed beast and said impatiently, "Who knows? Aren't you afraid of bursting from eating so fast?" As soon as Rubu finished speaking, Hui Mao stopped chasing the clawed beasts. The remaining clawed beasts took this opportunity to escape. What happened to it? Armadillo saw that Hui Mao had suddenly stopped moving and was squatting in the distance, doing something unknown. Only his ears twitched from time to time, and his hooked tail wagged quite a bit, as if he had discovered something new. When Rubu heard Armadillo's words, he stopped chewing and looked at Hui Mao. Hui Mao maintained his squatting position for a while, then he opened his mouth and spat out a black sharp-clawed beast that he had just swallowed. Armadillo and Rubu were speechless. Disgusting. Not long after the black claw beasts were swallowed, they went in alive. By the time they were spat out, a layer of them had been digested. Even the claws of the claw beasts had been dissolved, becoming shorter and softer. They were not as sharp as before. The sharp-clawed beast that was half digested looked like a waste product. It was no longer as ferocious and murderous as before. "Does that cat have the habit of chewing itself?" Armadillo asked. Rubu turned its head away, disgusting. Felines are indeed eccentric animals. It knew there were a few big cats in AF1 that liked to play with their prey until they were crippled before eating them. In comparison, the cat in front of it was even crazier. It was chewing itself. Because of Hui Mao's disgusting behavior, Rubu lost its appetite. It lifted its paw and kicked the remaining sharp-clawed beast into the woods. There were some small animals waiting to collect the leftovers. The remaining sharp-clawed beast was quickly surrounded by some small rodents that broke out from the ground. Not long after, not even its bones were left. "Hey, something is wrong with that cat. Is it food poisoning?" Armadillo wagged his tail and poked Rubu, who was lying on the ground with its eyes closed. Rubu immediately became energetic when he heard the word, food poisoning. He had just eaten half of the sharp-clawed beast, so it should not be poisonous. It could even smell poisonous meat. Of course, there might be some special circumstances. A lizard and a wolf stared at Hui Mao. Hui Mao was jumping around the half-digested sharp-clawed beast. After jumping for a while, Hui Mao stretched out its paw. Its short paw grew longer, and it started to cut open the stomach of the sharp-clawed beast. Armadillo and Rubu were speechless. Why didn't they know that cats had such a weird habit? It was understandable if Hui Mao wanted to eat the internal organs, but the problem was that it was really dissecting the cat. Can you imagine a cat that was excited to find food spitting out the food it swallowed and dissecting it? What a scam. In fact, Rubu and Armadillo couldn't feel Hui Mao's current mood. Hui Mao was very excited at the moment, because it keenly discovered something fun. It hadn't played with this thing for a long time, and Silen also hadn't played with it for a long time. When it was digesting the sharp-clawed beast, Hui Mao discovered that there was another kind of animal living in the sharp-clawed beast's body. If it was right, it was the parasite that Silen mentioned. Every time he found a new parasite with great potential, Silen would always make something to play with. Compared to those big guys, Hui Mao preferred to play with these small things. It used its claws to cut open the half-digested skin of the sharp-clawed beast, and then cut open its stomach. There was a worm in the stomach that looked like a small scorpion, and it was only the size of an adult's thumb. It clung tightly to the wall of the sharp-clawed beast's stomach, and the stomach wall of the sharp-clawed beast was much thinner. The worms attached to the sharp-clawed beast's stomach wall would steal the energy of the food, and a part of the food that the sharp-clawed beast swallowed would be digested by these worms. When the sharp-clawed beast's stomach was cut open, the worms realized that they were in danger and wanted to escape. They used their claws to tear open the already thin stomach wall and tried to escape. However, their speed was still not as fast as Hui Mao. Hui Mao stretched out its claws and pulled the worms back, then ran and pulled them back. On the hillside, Rubu and Armadillo were stunned by what they saw. "What is that thing?" Rubu asked. I don't know. It seems to be from the sharp-clawed beast's stomach. Rubu, did you eat the sharp-clawed beast's stomach? Armadillo asked worriedly. Before it knew what was going on, it wasn't sure if the worms would affect them or not. Armadillo shivered when he thought of the worms in their stomach, and the scales on his body stood up. No, I was disgusted by that thing before I had the chance to eat it. Rubu was glad that it didn't continue to chew on the sharp-clawed beast, otherwise it might have eaten the whole thing. Rubu and Armadillo didn't pay attention to this when they ate before, but after witnessing Weeza's actions today, they were probably going to be traumatized for a long time to come. They had to make sure that there were no strange insects in their meat before they ate. Huh? Armadillo raised its tail and swung Rubu, who was trying to check its stomach, and pointed in a direction with its chin. Rubu looked in the direction that Armadillo pointed. About 300 meters away from where Huimao was, there was a human teenager hiding behind a few big rocks. Judging from the teenager's attire, he should be a hunter from the city. He had a gun and a crossbow in his hand, and he was carefully hiding behind the rocks, staring at Huimao's direction. He looked very nervous, but he tried to stay calm. All in all, he was a pretty good hunter. Should we remind the cat? Armadillo asked. Remind it what? Rubu didn't care. Remind it not to eat people randomly. Rubu was speechless. This was indeed a problem. As usual, Dan too joined the hunting team in the morning to hunt croc beasts. However, he saw an injured croc beast on the way, and he didn't want to give it up. After all, a croc beast could be exchanged for more resources, and it was much better than those small croc beasts. Moreover, this croc beast was injured. Dan too thought this was a good opportunity, so he informed the team leader. The team leader gave him 30 minutes, and if he couldn't come back within 30 minutes, they would not wait for him. A lone hunter would most likely be eaten by the croc beasts, no matter how strong the hunter was. After all, the area outside the city was the croc beast's territory. When the communicator was switched on, the magnetic field would be very strong, and the croc beasts were very sensitive to magnetic fields. Therefore, all the hunters who came out to hunt would turn off their communicators, or they would be attacked by the croc beasts that followed the scent of blood. Dan too had learned a lot of skills from the experienced croc beasts since he was a child. He joined the hunting team when he was 10, and now he could be considered an experienced hunter. He knew how to hide and track. Dan too carefully chased after the injured croc beast, thinking about the best time to make his move. He couldn't afford to run into other croc beasts, or it would be difficult for Dan too alone. Finally, Dan too found an opportunity. However, just as he was about to make his move, the injured croc beast suddenly screamed and ran in another direction anxiously. Was he exposed? Dan too was about to continue chasing, but he suddenly sensed something coming, so he hid again. Not long after, two croc beasts ran past them, as if something terrifying was chasing them. This should be the reason why the injured croc beast was so anxious. Dan too looked in the direction the two croc beasts had come from. Just what was it that could make the two croc beasts so afraid? What did the croc beasts see? The croc beasts had always claimed to be the overlords of this gray land. The injured croc beast would not be able to catch up with them in such a short time, and there were only 15 minutes left. Go back. Dan too was reluctant. His mind was filled with questions. In the end, driven by curiosity, Dan too carefully sneaked in the direction the croc beast came from. Not long after, he saw a flat ground at the foot of a mountain. There was a cat squatting on the ground. There were no cats on this planet. He had only seen them in books, magazines, and on TV in the city. Those who hadn't read magazines or TV would not know that there was such an animal called a cat. Why was there a cat here? But what surprised Dan too even more was that, according to the book, a cat's attack power wasn't strong, but this small cat was standing in front of an unknown thing. Dan too studied it carefully for a long time before he realized that it was a croc beast. If it weren't for his understanding of the croc beast, he wouldn't have been able to recognize the croc beast that had been severely corroded. How did the croc beast become like this? Why was the cat squatting beside it in a daze? However, what happened next shocked Dan Tuesday. The cat's claws could instantly grow so long that it easily cut open the croc beast's skin and dissected it. When he saw the insects, Dan Tu's face turned pale, just like the first time he killed a croc beast. Fear, Dan Tu was now quite afraid. He regretted coming here out of curiosity. Wasn't this just courting death? Everything on TV and in books was fucking fake. How could a cat be a weak animal? Would a weak animal dissect a croc beast so easily? He was now absolutely sure that the croc beasts were afraid of this cat. This cat was not even as long as his forearm. He tried to calm his racing heart and think of a plan. He couldn't turn on the communicator. If he did, he would be discovered. He couldn't call for help, and no one would come to save him. It was best to retreat quietly. As soon as he turned his head, a voice came from beside him. Yo, kid, where do you think you're going? Dan too was startled. He reflexively prepared to shoot, but before he could do so, his vision went black and he lost consciousness. Hui Mao sniffed Dan Tu's body and looked at the gun and crossbow on Dan Tu with disgust. It was as Silin had said, this place was really poor and backward. However, the young man's physique was quite good. He could be used to test the insects. There were only 3 insects left in the claw beast's stomach. Originally, he wanted to knock them out, but he didn't control his strength well and killed a few of them. A few of them were severely injured, and he didn't know if they could recover. However, it didn't matter if they couldn't recover. He could just catch a few more to see. Although not all claw beasts had these insects in their bodies, he would find them eventually. The gray cat didn't have anything to store the 3 fainted insects and the severely crippled insects. It just so happened that it found a hard leather bag on Dan Tu's body. It was a bag made from the skin of a claw beast that had been processed, so it should be able to store the insects temporarily. Armadillo and Ruble were walking over. They didn't want to let the cat eat people, and they wanted to bring the man back for interrogation. However, when they got close, they bumped into the bag that Hui Mao threw at them. Hey, you two, come and help me with this. Hui Mao pointed at the bag that contained the insects and said. Armadillo and Ruble avoided the bag as if it was the plague. You can take your own things. We can just drag this man back, Ruble said. No, this is my experiment. After that, we ignored Armadillo and Rubu and tied the bag to Dan Tu's body. Then, it used the rope it found from Dan Tu's body to reinforce the bag a couple of times before dragging Dan Tu back to the spaceplane by the collar. It wasn't exactly dragging Dan Tu all the way back to the spaceplane, but Wiz wasn't dragging him all the way back to the spaceplane. Armadillo and Ruble looked at each other, shook their heads, and followed closely. They didn't know what the cat would do when it returned. Experiment? What experiment? Put the insects into that man's body? Disgusting. On the aircraft, Nikki had already hacked into the city's network to get some basic information. The city's network was not well developed, and it could be said to be simple and crude. All the appliances looked like antiques to them. Silin and the others were analyzing the information they had gathered, but they couldn't find the rat that Hui Mao mentioned. Where was the mysterious man hiding in this city? Just as they were discussing whether they should grab a local and interrogate them, the display showed the scene of the gray cat dragging a person into the spaceplane. Bai Yi and the others looked at Silin at the same time. Silin shrugged. I didn't order him to do that. Sadia gave Silin a thumbs up. You've trained your pet well. Silin curled his lips. There was no way that the cat dragging the man into the aircraft was the reason that they thought it was. As expected, after understanding the situation, they were very interested in the insects that Hui Mao mentioned. But they couldn't look at it here, so they went to the quarantine room. After putting down the partition, Bai Yi and the others didn't enter the quarantine room under Armadillo and Ruble's persuasion. Instead, they stood on the other side of the partition and looked at the scene inside. Silin had worked with Hui Mao many times. He first used a device to simulate the environment of a stomach. The 3 parasites that had recovered and the ones that were severely injured by Hui Mao were very excited when they entered the environment. They attached themselves to the edge of the wall and stabilized their bodies. The edge of the wall where they attached themselves became much thinner, and they began to absorb the nutrients in the internal environment. The severely injured parasites gradually recovered, and their severed limbs began to grow back. "How is it?" "Not bad, right?" Hui Mao said proudly. "Not bad." Silen locked the parasites in a small box that simulated the environment of a stomach. "But it's not very practical right now. We're going up against robots, and robots don't have stomachs." Hui Mao's ears twitched, and he wasn't too happy about it. "But you did a good job this time. You deserve to be praised." Silen rubbed Hui Mao's head. "That's more like it." Hui Mao narrowed his eyes, thinking about when he should catch a few more claw beasts to see if there were any other insects. It was boring to stay here anyway. After studying the insects, everyone shifted their attention to the person that Hui Mao dragged back. He looked like a 14 or 15-year-old boy, but judging from his physique, outfit, and the equipment he carried, this boy was also a tough character. When Dan Tu woke up, the first thing he felt when he opened his eyes was an unfamiliar environment. It wasn't the gray land, nor was it any city. It was so strange that it felt like he had come to another world. The next moment, Dan Tu's attention was focused on Hui Mao, who was squatting on the shoulder of a stranger. It was this cat that caused him to end up like this. Dan Tu didn't panic when he saw the strangers, unlike when he saw Hui Mao. After all, he felt safer facing a human than a beast that he couldn't understand at all. Moreover, Dan Tu didn't sense any ill will from these strangers. Of course, it could just be a facade. Hui Mao squatted on Silen's shoulder and licked its paw. This action alone made the boy, who had just woken up, tremble and shrink back. Silen flicked Hui Mao's ear. "What did you do to him?" The boy was scared out of his wits. Sadia looked at Hui Mao, then at Armadillo and Ruble, and sighed. These 2 ferocious-looking fellows couldn't even compare to a little kitten. Seeing that the boy was full of wariness, Nikki went straight into action. After all, a little girl who looked like she was only 7 or 8 years old was easier to get close to. "Don't be afraid. As long as you don't move, we won't hurt you. We just want to ask you some questions," Nikki said. Dan Tu didn't say anything as he stared at the little girl in front of him who gave off a strange vibe. Nikki asked a few more questions, but Dan Tu still didn't say anything. His entire body was on high alert. Qi Lafang pointed at his mouth. "Language barrier." Nikki slapped her forehead. How could she have forgotten? The people here didn't speak the Empire's common tongue. The native language was too small, and the Empire didn't have any records of it. However, when Hui Mao and the others went out to hunt, Nikki had already gathered enough information about the language from various cities on the planet. After setting up the translation machine, she directly translated the language into Dan Tu's. So, after Nikki turned on the machine, she asked the same question again. Finally, Dan Tu spoke, his voice a little hoarse. "What do you want to ask?" Silen handed him a glass of fruit juice. "Fruit juice. It's not poisonous." Dan Tu hesitated for a moment, then glanced at Hui Mao on Silen's shoulder. Seeing that the dog was lazily licking its paw and wasn't paying attention to them, he carefully took the glass of fruit juice from Silen, took a small sip, paused, and then poured the entire contents into his mouth. After finishing, he licked the glass, as if he hadn't had enough. Silen handed him another glass. This time, Dan Tu didn't hesitate and drank it in large gulps. Dan Tu had never tasted something like this before. It was delicious, much better than the most expensive drink in the city. He wanted to bring this back for Grandpa to drink. Grandpa was so old that he probably hadn't tasted this much fruit juice. However, he couldn't even protect himself right now. He didn't even know if he could go back and see Grandpa again. Dan too didn't lower his guard much after drinking the fruit juice, but his voice was no longer hoarse. He seemed to have calmed down as well. This was a good sign. After calming down, Dan too answered all of Nicky's basic questions. He told Sillin and the others his name, as well as the black-clawed beast that Huimao had eaten was called a croc beast. In the local language, it meant sharp claws. However, the croc beast was a general term for all kinds of black beasts with sharp claws. Very few of them were of a single species, and most of them were born in clusters. However, there were a few special breeds among the croc beasts. One of them was called Galas, a fierce beast that was several times larger than ordinary croc beasts. Its attack power was much stronger, but they were relatively few in number. Nicky asked Dan too if he had any way to bring them into the city. Dan too shook his head. Apart from the guards and hunting squads, no one else is allowed to enter or leave the city without the permission of the city lord. City lord? What rank is that? Nicky asked. Although they had learned some information through the city's communication network, it was still limited. The network here was too backward, and people rarely communicated with each other through the network. This was the system of social relations in a special technological environment. The city lord is the highest-ranking official in our city. Dan too paused for a moment before asking, "You're not from this planet, are you?" Nicky didn't deny it. The answer was obvious, so there was no need to deny it. "Yes, we're from this planet." "Then it's even more impossible for us to let you into the city. We're very repulsed by aliens, especially the city lord. There was once an alien who entered our planet due to a malfunctioning spaceship and never returned. Although that didn't happen in our city, I've heard people say that something similar happened in our city before." "Are you threatening us?" Nicky sneered. "No, just a reminder." Dan too lowered his head and didn't say anything else. No one could tell what he was thinking. At this moment, Huimao spoke up. "I think this kid isn't telling the truth. Why don't we try using that bug?" Rubu and Armadillo, who were standing behind them, thought at the same time, cats really are evil creatures. Hearing Huimao's words, Dan too suddenly raised his head. A flash of fear flashed across his eyes, and he reached for his gun and hunting knife out of habit. Only when he touched empty air did he remember that everything on him had been confiscated. Fight? Although he wasn't tied up, Dan too knew that he was no match for them. Not to mention that he had this cat with him. Sillin flicked Huimao. "Don't scare a kid." Huimao snorted twice. "It was just a scare, it was too boring." Nicky asked a few more questions, but she didn't get the answers she wanted. It was impossible to let Dan too go, so they could only lock him up here for now. If there was any new information, they could ask him for reference. They arranged a small room for Dan Tuesday. Although the room looked simple to Sillin and the others, it was an unimaginable luxury for Dan Tuesday. There was also juice and other food that he hadn't eaten yet. Although he didn't have to worry about food, Dan too's nerves were challenged. If this continued for a few days, he would probably have a nervous breakdown. That was because the cat would come here every now and then. It didn't say anything and just crouched there, licking its paws. Whenever Dan too saw the cat's paws, he would think of the croc's belly being cut open. Huimao, on the other hand, was delighted. There were actually people who were afraid of cats. Chapter 273. When dusk approached, Dan too was brought to the control room once more. When he saw Sillin and the others again, Dan too was no longer as fearful and surprised as before. Other than looking at Huimao a little cautiously, he was much calmer than before. It had to be said that this young man's mental fortitude was quite good. Perhaps it was due to the environment he lived in, but he was much calmer and more mature than his peers from other peaceful planets. However, Dan too's calmness crumbled when he saw the projection in the center of the control room. There was a table in the center of the control room, and on it was a projection of the entire city that Nicky had sent out when a patrol team was returning to the city. After entering the city, the miniature detectors split into several smaller parts and scanned the entire metal city from different directions. After scanning, the information would be transmitted to the flying craft to form a comprehensive map. The metal city's outdated defense system would not be able to detect any external detectors sneaking in and transmitting information to the outside world. Even after living in this city for more than 10 years, Dan too had never seen the entirety of it. But now, he was seeing it in front of an alien. Even if the city's landmarks were shrunk several times, Dan too would still be able to recognize them at a glance. Dan too was afraid that Sillin and the others would really harm the people in the city. The difference in technology between the two sides was too great. If a battle were to break out, even if they won in the end, they would have to pay a heavy price. Those who would become cannon fodder would definitely be the isolated people living at the bottom of society. Like Dan too and the lonely old man next door, Grandpa and Nikki saw Dan too's reaction and smiled. "We're not that interested in this city. We just want to find someone in it. This person is hiding in your city, and he has the same technology as us. He was the one who told us to come. Otherwise, we wouldn't have paid attention to a poor little planet in a corner of the empire." Dan too relaxed a little when he heard Nikki's words, but he was also very curious about the person Nikki was talking about. Just what kind of person would hide in their city and do something like this? At the same time, Dan too also had some understanding of Nikki's goal. "I don't know the person you're talking about, and I've never heard of anyone in the city with high-level technology," Dan too said. "I don't expect you to know," Nikki pointed at the projection on the table. "We'll look for him ourselves, but I hope you can help us with something." "What is it?" "We need to borrow your place." Nikki stopped the rotating projection and moved it in front of Dan Tuesday. Dan too pursed his lips. After a moment of silence, he looked at the people around him. "Will you hurt the people in the city?" Sadia chuckled when he heard that. "We're not begging you, kid. We can find another solution even without your help, but that might hurt other people in the city. You don't want your compatriots to be hurt, do you? Hurry up, we don't have that much patience. There's a cunning fox in the city waiting for us to catch it. We Shan too, and we is." Chi Lafang purposely emphasized on killing the innocent. If the people they ran into weren't innocent, then they couldn't be blamed. They had no choice but to be cautious when it came to Black Viper, or else they would be the ones to die. Dan too hesitated for a moment before walking forward and pointing at his place on the projection. It was a poor area of the city, and most of the residents were widows and widows. Dan too lived in a 6-story metal building. The area of each house was very small. The largest was only about 30 square meters. Dan too's living area was only about 10 square meters. It was not even 1/3 of the size of their control room. Rent was a big problem. Dan too and the others could only afford the rent there. Buildings of higher quality, sturdier, and better security would cost them an astronomical sum. Dan too told them the exact location of his place, and the surveillance device hidden in the city quietly flew in that direction. It didn't take long for it to arrive at the building Dan too had mentioned, and the situation of the entire building was clearly displayed. The neighbor to the left of Dan too's place was drying dried meat and talking to a few other people standing in the hallway. Their conversation could be heard clearly. As for the neighbor on the right side of Dan too's house, the door was closed, and Sillin didn't know what kind of person he was. However, he could tell from Dan too's eyes that the person who lived there was very important to him. Dan too didn't seem to care about the other people who appeared in the image, but the moment the image was displayed, the first thing Dan too looked at wasn't his house, but the neighbor's house on the right. Fortunately, there weren't many patrols there. Since it was a poor area, patrols didn't often appear there. Most of them were around the high-class residential areas to ensure the safety of the people living there and prevent flying beasts from attacking them. Nikki stopped asking Dan too questions after she was done with her investigation. Instead, she watched as Chi Lafang and Sadia studied the so-called high-class residential areas in the city. They would have to wait until the sky was completely dark before they moved out. Because of the environment, most people in the city wouldn't go out at night. Only the patrols would roam the city. No one paid attention to Dan too, but he didn't run away either. It was because he knew that he had no chance of escaping from these people. Whoosh, a flying car model flew into the room, and there was a cat standing on top of it. The cat was holding a box in its mouth. Dan too wanted to dodge out of reflex when he saw Huimao, but he was attracted by the flying car model again. The difference in technology made Dan too very curious about flying objects like this. Huimao flew the flying car model to Silan and put down the box. Assemble this too, Silan. Inside the box was one of Silan's prizes from the flying car race. It was one of the two flying car models Fleeka had made based on Vegfritter, and the other one was in Naimi's possession. Although it couldn't have Vegfritter's complicated and diverse internal structure, it was still quite extravagant for a toy model. A small toy model like this was enough to buy a flying car that was about the same size. Of course, luxurious flying cars and racing cars were an exception. There was still some time before the operation anyway, so Silan took the box, sat down and started assembling the flying car model. Huimao lay on top of the flying car model and watched it with his tail wagging. From time to time, he would shoot a smug glance at Ruble and Armadillo who were lying on the other side of the control room. Ruble and Armadillo were so angry that they gritted their teeth and thought, so what if you have a toy? Dan too was very curious about the flying car model. It was probably the flying car they were talking about on TV. It looked a little different, but they were all similar. He didn't expect to see such a small toy. Dan too wanted to get closer to see Silan's assembly, but he was very wary of Huimao. After pacing back and forth for a while, his curiosity won over his fear and he inched closer to Huimao. Huimao only glanced at him once and then ignored him. Dan too let out a sigh of relief. Silan's assembly speed wasn't fast, but it was rhythmic and practiced. Every part was assembled precisely. Dan too grew more and more fascinated by the round, pancake-shaped object that was slowly taking shape in Silan's hands. It felt like a whirlpool was sucking all of his attention into it, and he was more than happy to be sucked into it himself. Do you have your own flying car? Silan asked. His voice was low and slow. Dan too shook his head as he stared at the model in Silan's hands that was slowly taking shape. I'm assembling a flying car model right now. This kind of flying car was despised by people for a long time, but after a race, everyone changed their opinion of it. Silan explained a few things while he was assembling the model. Then, he asked, what would you do if you had your own flying car? Dan too looked very puzzled. Then, he started thinking, I would fly Grandpa around the city and show him how the city is doing. The city has doubled in size, and a lot of new places have been built. Grandpa? Yes. Without Grandpa, I wouldn't have lived until now. Dan too's mother had passed away a long time ago, and his father had gone out to hunt when he was 7 and never returned. Less than a fifth of the hunting party had made it back to the city alive because they had encountered a Gala's beast, one of the strongest of the sharp-clawed beasts. Dan too had no ability to hunt alone, and the people around him did not help him, because there were too many such examples in the city, so many that everyone was numb. When Dan too was about to starve to death, he rarely went out, and Grandpa, who was not familiar with everyone, gave him food. Grandpa An's savings were left behind by his children, but after they passed away, the old man seemed to have become a lot quieter and rarely left the house. Because of his disability, he was always in a wheelchair with no one to take care of him. Everyone in the control room listened to Dan too's words. Chi Lafang and Sadia exchanged a glance. If their guess was correct, Silan had hypnotized Dan too. Why else would the vigilant little guy talk so much? Dan too's expression softened a lot when he talked about what happened after he met Grandpa, but when he mentioned that Silan and the others wanted to borrow Dan too's house in the city, Dan too's face contorted as if he was resisting something. Big beads of sweat rolled down his forehead, and Dan too abruptly raised his head to glare at Silan. The fury and madness in his eyes made Silan feel like the little guy was going to swing a knife at him the next moment. What did you do to me? Dan too huffed and puffed. His fingers curled into fists, but they were shaking uncontrollably. He had said too much just now, and he was bound to slip up. Sillin smiled and assembled the last part. Then, he passed it to Huimao and told it to play on the side. Your willpower is not bad, Celine commented. You can't hurt Grandpa, you can't. Dan too roared at Sillin. I didn't say I was going to hurt him. Sillin stood up and patted his thighs. Then, he walked out of the control room, but stopped after taking 2 steps. He turned around and said to Dan too, you smiled when you were telling me about your relationship with that grandpa, and someone once told me that blinking when you smile means that you are truly thinking of something that makes you happy. Dan too loosened his clenched fists, then clenched them again. Indeed, there was a time when Dan too felt very happy. Although he was already an orphan at that time, he had Grandpa by his side. He was the old man who always sat in a wheelchair and told Dan too stories that he had never heard before. He taught him how to hunt and how to protect himself. Dan too's wish was that one day, he could hunt enough things to exchange for enough currency in the city. Then, he could pick up Grandpa from next door and live in a sturdier and more spacious building like a fortress, and live a better life. Before it was completely dark, the last hunting team that left the city returned to the city. It was the hunting team that Dan too was in. The hunting team did not see Dan too within the allotted time, and Dan too's communicator could not be contacted. So, according to past experience, Dan too had either met with an accident, or he was lost somewhere. Either way, it was the same result, because in both cases, the chance of surviving alone was close to 0. Moreover, Dan too was only a 15-year-old boy. Even though he had nearly 5 years of hunting experience, he was still lacking in many aspects. He could not compare to the experienced hunters. When they were about to return to the city, they still could not contact Dan Tuesday. Finally, the hunting team gave up and returned to the city with the results of today's hunt. However, when the hunting team entered the city gate, no one noticed that there was a person hiding in the pile of croc beast corpses. There was a small protrusion in an inconspicuous place on the armored vehicle. Very good, Sillin has successfully entered. Inside the aircraft, Nikki said as she looked at the image sent back by the transmitter on Sillin's body. Behind Nikki, Rubu and Armadillo were both in the control room. They did not go out like the others. Dan too sat quietly to the side, nervously watching the extraterrestrials' movements. Not far from the city, Sadia and Chilafang were lying in ambush. Only Sillin and Bai Yi had entered the city. Bai Yi and Sillin's group had entered the city. Bai Ye's target was the mayor's residence, while Sillin went to Dan too's residence first. Everyone split up. The equipment in the city was much less advanced, so they could not detect Bai Yi and Sillin at all. As for Huimao, they could not detect him at all. After Sillin entered the city, he found an opportunity to leave the hunting team and hide in a secluded place, waiting for night to fall. When the sky was completely dark and everyone was hiding in their houses, Sillin snuck towards Dan too's residence. Most of the hunters in the city were experienced hunters, and they were very sensitive to danger and changes in their surroundings. There were many things that could not be faked with technology. That was why both Sillin and Bai Yi were very cautious in the city. The layout of the entire city was deeply imprinted in Sillin's mind, so it did not take long for Sillin to arrive at the building where Dan too lived. With Celine's hearing, he could hear a few families talking about the Dantu. Today, the hunting team had brought news that Dan too had not returned to the city. In the eyes of these people, Dan too was definitely not coming back. However, from their tone, it was obvious that these people only treated the Dan too as a topic to kill time after a meal. They did not feel much sympathy or regret for him. Because they were numb, they were indifferent. The relationships between people here were just like the city, filled with the cold light of metal. In this special environment, no one would criticize others for being right or wrong. Here, the living were always right. Sillin arrived at the floor of Dan too's residence. There was no one outside the building now. There were always unknown dangers lurking in the dark, and it was the safest place for the people here to hide in their homes at night. When he passed by Grandpa Ann's house that Dan too had mentioned, Sillin paused for a moment and shot a glance at the house whose door was tightly shut and completely devoid of light. It was only then that he stood in front of Dan too's house, took out the key that Dan too had given him and opened the door. However, the moment he opened the door, Sillin sensed that there was someone inside the house. Inside the aircraft, the image on the screen in front of Nikki began to stutter and then completely cut off. The received signal had been jammed. Electromagnetic interference. How could there be electromagnetic interference at such a high level? That person was there. This was the first thing that came to Nikki's mind. She quickly contacted Bai Yi and Chi Lafeng and Sadia, who were outside the city. Sillin went on high alert the moment he sensed that there was someone inside the house. He dodged the incoming wind and blocked the opponent's punches and kicks. Then, he leaned to the side and used the ground to bounce off the ground. His other hand unsheathed a long sword and pointed it at the opponent. The image that Sillin sent to the aircraft was only cut off for a moment. Huimao's interference was removed, and the image was restored. There was no light in the house, but Sillin could clearly see the person in front of him through the faint light that seeped in from the outside. The aircraft could also clearly see the person standing in front of Sillin through the night vision filter. After seeing this person, the person who reacted the most was not Nikki and the others, but Dan Tuesday. Dan too rose from his chair in agitation. His eyes were filled with disbelief. Impossible. How could it be her? Didn't she already? That woman looks a little familiar, Chi Lafeng, who was somewhere outside the city, said after seeing the image that Nikki sent them. Nikki shook her head. I don't remember. I saw her not too long ago. Although we didn't talk, I remember that she was one of the people who participated in the same race as that kid, Sillin, Sadia said as he watched the image. Dan too's house. The person in front of Sillin didn't continue to attack. In fact, she didn't show any killing intent just now. It was precisely because of this that Sillin didn't kill her. Otherwise, he would have slashed her down a long time ago. Sillin pointed the tip of his blade at the person in front of him. Truth be told, he didn't expect to see this person here. We meet again, Chiu Su. Chapter 274. Chiu Su wasn't nervous about being pointed at by Sillin's blade. On the contrary, Chiu Su was very calm, as if everything was within her expectations. The lights in the room weren't turned on, and the door wasn't closed. Huimao walked in from outside, glanced at the two people in the room, and then paid them no more attention. He believed that Sillin could handle this. Dan Tu's residence was indeed very small, and the decorations were also very simple. Huimao walked around the room, and then looked at a wall. Behind this wall was another house. The grandpa that Dan Tu had mentioned lived there. However, Huimao jumped up, and with a hook of his claws, he dug out a small device. This device could not only monitor everything in the room, but it could also be used as an alarm and initial defense. However, this defense system had already been turned off when Chiu Su arrived. Otherwise, Sillin wouldn't have been able to enter with just a key, and he would also be electrocuted by the device as an enemy attack. Apart from this device, there was also a device next to the lights on the ceiling that looked similar to a light, but it was actually an intelligent laser emitter. Next, Huimao dug out a few other devices. These devices were mainly used for defense, and their main purpose was to protect the owner of the house, which was to protect Dan Tuesday. The level of technology used in these devices didn't match the development of this planet at all. Dan Tu, who was in the spaceplane, was dumbfounded. He didn't recognize these devices, and even after living here for so many years, he didn't know that there were so many unexpected things in such a small, rundown house. If Nikki hadn't explained the functions of these devices to him, even if Dan Tu saw them, he wouldn't have known what they were for, and might even have thrown them away like garbage. Chiu Su didn't say anything, and she didn't show any dissatisfaction with Huimao's behavior. Instead, she looked out the door. Not long after, a shadow appeared outside. It was Bai Yi. After receiving Nikki's notice, Bai Yi immediately rushed over from the city lord's residence. After all, the purpose of their trip was to find the person who sent the message, not to study the city lord. Seeing Bai Yi flash in, Chiu Su said to Bai Yi and Silan, "Since the two of you are here, come with me." Chiu Su ignored the knife pointed at her and walked out of the door. Silan sheathed his sword and gestured to Bai Yi. Then, the two of them followed Chiu Su out. Although they were confused, it was necessary to be vigilant. As for Hui Mao, that guy just dug a hole and went next door. Just as Hui Mao and Silan had thought, Chiu Su's destination was the house next door, which was Grandpa An's house that Dan Tu had mentioned. When Silan passed by the shop, he could feel the mechanical activity inside. It was a machine that surpassed the average level of technology in this place. Places with machines would have a special mechanical language for communication. This was the advantage that Silan and Hui Mao had over others. Since Hui Mao had suppressed the electromagnetic interference, the situation here could be seen from the aircraft. Dan Tu was the most agitated one. He hoped that things weren't as he thought, but as Silan and the others entered the room next door, Dan Tu's heart sank. Everything was fake. The house wasn't big, but compared to Dan Tu's, it was a little more spacious. As soon as he entered, Silan saw an old man in a wheelchair. The old man was holding a paper book in his hand. The solar lamp on the table next to him was dim, but for Silan and Bai Yi, it was enough for them to see everything in the house clearly. Hui Mao dug a hole next door and shook his hair. His enlarged pupils swept around the house, and then he jumped onto Silan's shoulder. After Chiu Su brought them in, she closed the door and stood behind the old man. Although the old solar lamp wasn't very bright, the processed image sent back to the aircraft was clear enough. Dan Tu looked at Chiu Su on the image, his eyes full of doubt. "You know her?" Nikki asked. Dan Tu nodded, then shook his head. "At first glance, she looks like her, but now that I look closer, there are some differences." "Who does she look like?" Nikki asked. "Grandpa An's daughter." Dan Tu had seen that woman when he was young. He heard from his father that she was a very powerful female warrior, but after a hunt, she never came back. Everyone said that she was dead. And this girl on the screen, who looked about the same age as him, what was her relationship with Grandpa An? Why did she look so much like that woman? Inside the house, the old man in the wheelchair closed the book, looked up at Silan and Bai Yi, then looked at the cat on Silan's shoulder, looking around, and smiled. "You're finally here." As he spoke, the old man stood up from the wheelchair, walked 2 steps to the bookshelf, and placed the book on it. How is this possible? Isn't Grandpa An? Dan Tu's mind was a mess. This old man in the wheelchair wasn't a cripple. Nikki sneered. "Who said that people in wheelchairs are cripples?" "Yes, who said that people in wheelchairs must be cripples?" Dan Tu remembered that Grandpa An had always worn a long robe all these years, completely covering his feet, not letting anyone touch his legs. Even Dan Tu had always thought that it was because of Grandpa An's pride, but now he knew that the truth was not what people thought it was. Who was Grandpa An? How long had he been hiding in the city? Dan Tu didn't know that Grandpa An had been like this for as long as he could remember. Perhaps no one in the entire building would have thought that such a lonely old man turned out to be an alien. Moreover, the so-called lonely and helpless pitiful people were also fake. What people saw and thought was the impression that the old man wanted to create, and everything was under the old man's control. After putting the book down, the old man walked back to the wheelchair and sat down. He looked in Silan's direction, and his eyes were focused on the signal transmitter that Silan was carrying. Dan Tu, you're over there, right? Hee, Dan Tu, don't worry, they won't hurt you. After saying that, the old man looked at Silan. The signal has been cut, right? Some things are not good for others to hear. Okay. Sillin disconnected the signal transmitter, and Hui Mao on his shoulder cooperated and stopped blocking the electromagnetic interference signal. That way, no one outside would know what happened inside the room. Bai Yi also turned off the signal transmitter and quietly waited for the old man to continue. The old man was very satisfied with Sillin and Bai Yi's decisiveness in turning off the signal transmitter. The unknown messages that you received were sent by me. I mean no harm, I just want to remind you that if you go to Black Viper's place like this, you will suffer a great loss. The old man's voice was calm, and there was no emotion in it. It was like he was stating something that did not matter. Who are you? Bai Yi asked. Bai Yi had been in AF1 for many years, and he knew a lot of the more secretive information, but he did not know anything about this old man. Based on instinct, he felt that the old man before him was not as simple as he appeared. He was like a reclusive expert, sitting in the corner with a book in his hand, quietly observing the changes in the empire. Who am I? Hee hee. The old man chuckled softly. Even if I told you, you would not have heard of me. However, if I did not say it, you would not believe what I am about to say. The old man's white hair was not messy, and the 2 strands of hair on the sides covered half of his eyes, making it impossible to see what he was thinking. Do you know who the leader of Black Viper is? The old man asked. Sillin frowned, but did not say anything. His knowledge was limited, and he only knew that the current leader of Black Viper had inherited the position of the previous leader. The son took over his father's position, and their surname was the same, Christie. If anyone said Black Viper's Christie, they must be referring to the current leader of Black Viper. Bai Yi was silent for a moment, and then answered, Feng Onlang, Christie Onlang Feng. Onlang Feng, yes, Christie Onlang Feng. The old man repeated in a low voice, and then looked at Sillin and Bai Yi. Everyone thinks that Onlang Feng is a person's name, but that is not the case. Onlang Feng is the name of 3 people. Sillin's eyelids twitched. He had a bad feeling about this. The old man looked straight at Sillin and Bai Yi. My name is Gu Chang'an. Gu Chang'an, there was an "n" in his name. The person working for Black Viper right now is Christie Onlang. As for Feng, you all know him. Sillin sighed inwardly. As expected. Guan Feng, Gu Chang'an, Christie Onlang. Feng Onlang, the leader of Black Viper. No one would have thought that there were 3 leaders of Black Viper, right? What on earth was Guan Feng trying to do? The old man waved his hand, and a floating projector flew over. The image of a planet was displayed on top of it. Chiao Su turned off the light. The image was enlarged, and Sillin and Bai Yi could see the general situation of the planet. The terrain, the environment, the layout. This is the planet you're going to, the old man said. This isn't Black Viper's headquarters, Sillin said with certainty. This isn't, but it is the place you're going to. If Guan Feng is also one of Black Viper's leaders, why do we need to find him? Sillin asked. Because the 2 of you are the people Guan Feng recommended. Recommended what? Gu Chang'an didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something that surprised both Sillin and Bai Yi. It's time for Black Viper to be replaced. Replaced? Replaced what? Black Viper was the Empire's biggest dark power. Why would they need to replace them? Hee hee, you'll have to find the answer yourselves. Don't turn me down, it's not a bad thing. Not a bad thing. Openly opposing the Empire wasn't a bad thing. You need to get an answer from Guan Feng, don't you? Isn't that right? Gu Chang'an looked very happy. Both Sillin and Bai Yi fell silent. Guan Feng's personal information was as follows: Imperial Tutor, Teacher of many royals and royals, one of the giants of AF1, Senior Academician of the Royal Academy of Sciences, Director of a military research project. Every student of his is a famous figure in the Empire, and Guan Feng's personal influence is among the top few in the Empire. But he's actually one of the leaders of Black Viper. Go, you'll know the answer when you get there. Of course, you'll need to be strong enough to survive. After all, you're just 2 of the recommended people. Gu Chang'an switched images while saying this. This is the most basic information. You can use it as a reference. There were some species similar to the croc beasts on this gray planet, but they were much faster, had tough skin, and had quick reflexes. They were highly intelligent species. Other than that, there was also a new robot army and biosoldiers. Sillin had seen a lot of biosoldiers in the past, and none of them had an absolute weakness. Some of them might be in the head, some in the heart, and some in other parts of the body. Their weaknesses could be determined by the distribution of their nerves after they mutated. On the other hand, when facing a biosoldier on the battlefield, one would not have the time to judge the distribution of the biosoldier's nerves. Hui Mao on Sillin's shoulder wasn't looking at the monsters and biosoldiers at all. His attention was completely drawn to a couple of inconspicuous robots among the robot army. Why does it feel so familiar? These are just a few of the things you'll encounter. Here's a piece of advice: familiarize yourself with the terrain. As long as you're familiar with the terrain, you'll have a life-saving trump card no matter what kind of opponent you run into. Neither Sillin nor White Knight asked why they should trust him. Gu Chang'an was definitely telling the truth, but he was hiding a lot of things. It was exactly because of this that Sillin and White Knight were caught between a rock and a hard place. If they didn't know so many secrets and Guanfeng's identity, they might be able to pretend that nothing had happened and continue their lives as if nothing had happened. But the problem was that they knew everything now. Therefore, there were only two paths in front of them. One was to betray Guanfeng, and the other was to betray the Empire. However, Sillin also thought of another possibility. Without enough evidence, he couldn't say these speculations out loud. If he did, he would die. This wasn't the League of Stars, but the Mist Bodhisattva Empire. Under this kind of system, Sillin would face endless pursuit and assassination if he went public. No force would dare to accept him, and even Genial would become a sacrifice. Go, find out the answer. Hui Mao desperately wanted Sillin to go, but he didn't tell Sillin about this. This place made him very uncomfortable, and the old man in front of him smiled like a fox. If you wanted to beat a fox, you had to be more cunning. Hui Mao admitted that he didn't have the intelligence to do so. Humans were a strange species, and their greatest success lay in their lies. That was the peak that Hui Mao couldn't learn even if he wanted to. If we're recommended by Teacher Guan, then what about you? Who did you recommend? Sillin asked Gu Chang'an. Me? Hee, I'll leave my post in peace. Gu Chang'an accepted the cup Chiu Su handed him and took 2 sips. Then, he waved his hands. Go, go. Don't disturb this old man's peaceful life any longer. Sillin and White Knight exchanged a glance with each other and decided to leave. Before leaving, Sillin asked Gu Chang'an, when is the deadline? There's no deadline, but it's best to prepare as soon as possible. The longer you drag things out, the more passive you'll be. Also, a word of advice, don't look at Black Viper the same way you used to. After Sillin and White Knight left, Gu Chang'an looked at Chiu Su who was standing next to him. Do you blame me? Why didn't I recommend you for such a good opportunity? No, Grandpa. I'm the one who doesn't have the strength, Chiu Su replied calmly. Gu Chang'an let out a long sigh. You should give up when you need to. Don't ever hope for a position that doesn't belong to you. He then smiled and said, you should go with your parents when the time comes. The people in this term are pretty good. Will that person come too? Of course. They're choosing a blade for him. Chapter 275. Sillin and White Knight didn't linger in the city for long. Instead, they found an opportunity to sneak out. They ran into Qi Lafang and Sadia, who were anxiously waiting outside. Sillin and White Knight didn't say a word no matter how much they asked. The more Qi Lafang and the others knew, the more danger they would be in. After returning to the spaceplane, Sillin and White Knight had a private discussion. Chi Lafang and the others had no idea what Sillin and White Knight were talking about, but they came to an agreement after White Knight came out. Sillin and White Knight would head to that planet, while the others would wait on another planet. They wouldn't go with Sillin and White Knight. Chi Lafang and the others didn't agree to this agreement at first. After all, they'd always worked together and worked well together before. Why couldn't they work together again this time? Wasn't it just Black Viper? What was there to be afraid of? But under Sillin and White Knight's insistence, Nikki was the first to nod, and the agreement was finally reached. Dan too was released back to the city the next day. They flew away from the gray planet and landed on a planet with decent development. Then, they split up. Sillin, White Knight, and Huimao piloted a spaceplane to their destination planet, while Nikki and the others waited on the same planet. Sillin and White Knight specifically told them to be careful. After all, there was no telling if Black Viper's spies were spying on them from the shadows. It was better to be vigilant. After Sillin and White Knight left, Nikki and the others stayed in the spaceplane's control room to discuss what Sillin and White Knight had learned in the city. Why were they so adamant about not revealing anything? Although they didn't know the reason, they knew that it had to be a big secret. Otherwise, Sillin and White Knight wouldn't have been so tight-lipped. What's the reason? Sadia swung his legs in his chair, a conflicted look on his face. What I don't understand the most is why only Sillin and White Knight are allowed to go. Why can't the rest of us go? Chi Lafang asked. Because you weren't recommended, a voice said. It wasn't the voice of any human or beast. It was slightly immature and completely unfamiliar. Who? Nikki's group, the lizard, and the wolf all went on high alert, but they couldn't find anyone. Their detectors didn't react at all. There was no warning, no strange activity. At this time, all the screens in the control room, be it the analysis screen or the imaging screen, had the same image on them. It was a crawling viper covered in eye-catching black stripes. On the other side, Sillin and White Knight piloted the spaceship toward their destination planet. According to the markings on the star map, they had already entered an unrecorded area. Many of the planets were unfamiliar to them, and many of them were non-habitable. The environmental conditions on them did not allow humans to live naturally. They continued flying and finally found the planet. From space, the planet looked similar to the image Gu Chang'an had shown them. Gu Chang'an had not lied to them about this. There were some orbiting satellites around the planet, as well as some small microarrays for monitoring and defense deployment. Sillin's aircraft flew closer and closer. Just as Sillin was wondering if they would be intercepted by the satellite array, Huimao suddenly opened his eyes and looked at the aircraft's display screen. In the next moment, a message appeared on the screen, "Welcome." Along with the message, there was also a flight path for Sillin and White Knight to follow it. Sillin and White Knight piloted the spaceplane and landed at a port on the planet according to the given flight path. The port was huge, but there was basically no one in sight. There was no human sound other than the sound of machinery. More than 99% of the equipment here was mechanized. A navigation robot flew over and led the way for Sillin and White Knight. "Please come with me. Someone is already waiting for you." "Someone is waiting for us." "Who?" After exiting the port, Sillin saw a flying car parked there. The window of the car rolled down, and he finally saw the person sitting in the driver's seat. It really was Guan Feng. When he saw Sillin and White Knight, Guan Feng waved at them and said with a smile, "Come on up, kids." Both Sillin and White Knight felt a sense of helplessness in their hearts at the same time. They had come all the way here and gotten themselves covered in mud, but not only was the culprit unharmed, he looked like he was in a very good mood. "Are you messing with us, Coach Guan?" Sillin said after they got into the car. "Hee, if you say so. However, this is a rare opportunity for you. I believe you won't disappoint me." Guan Feng started the car and left the port. The flying car was on autopilot, and the windows were specially made so that neither Sillin nor White Knight could see what was going on outside. Guan Feng turned around and looked at the silent Sillin and White Knight with a warm smile on his face. But to Sillin and White Knight, he looked like a fox no matter how they looked at him. "You've met Gu Chang'an, haven't you?" Guan Feng asked. It was a question, but his tone was certain. Sillin and White Knight nodded. "Then I'm sure you already know some things. My background is pretty complicated, but don't overthink it. This is Black Viper's territory, but don't look at it the same way you used to." This was the second time Sillin had heard this. Gu Chang'an had told them this before, and Guan Feng was saying the same thing now. If they didn't look at Black Viper the same way they used to, then what kind of attitude should they use? Guan Feng didn't mind Sillin and White Knight's silence. He continued, "I know you're angry, but there are some things I don't have a choice in. I only feel at ease when I find someone suitable and trustworthy." What does Gu Chang'an mean by recommendation and succession? Sillin asked. About that. Guan Feng tapped a finger on his knee. Recommendation is exactly what you think it is. I have a recommendation, and I'm recommending the two of you. As for succession, it's literally what it means. Some people in Black Viper are about to step down. They're old, and they may have the will, but they don't have the strength. Also, I need to give the younger generation more opportunities. We're changing leaders. That's right, 3 leaders. We 3 old fellows have occupied this position for long enough. Sillin fell silent for a moment before asking, what is the relationship between Black Viper and the Mist Bodhisattva royal family? Guan Feng wasn't surprised by Sillin's question. All I can tell you right now is that Black Viper was a gift from the previous emperor to his youngest son. However, even the emperor didn't expect this small gift to grow to such a shocking degree. It was as I thought. It was no wonder that the royal family had only announced Black Viper as a dark force and not a rebel force. If the Mist Bodhisattva royal family really wanted to clean up a faction, how could they have achieved so little after so many years? They were just using the excuse of cleaning up to get rid of some nobles. Are you relieved now? You don't have to worry about being labeled a traitor, Guan Feng said with a smile. Guan Feng looked very natural and relaxed in this place. Moreover, Sillin could sense that Guan Feng felt a sense of belonging to this place, or more accurately, to Black Viper. It was because this was Black Viper's territory that he acted so relaxed. He looked like a man who had just returned home, and he didn't need to disguise himself like he did outside. What on earth made Guan Feng feel this way towards Black Viper? Sillin didn't understand. The outside world's impression of Black Viper was mostly negative. As expected, one couldn't judge a book by its cover. Since Black Viper was related to the imperial family, it meant that this kind of behavior was allowed. He just didn't know if they would be forced to erase their memories after this incident. Guan Feng smiled as if he saw through Sillin's thoughts. Don't worry, we won't erase your memories as long as you come out alive. What if we don't? I believe you can come out alive. Guan Feng wasn't worried about Sillin and White Knight's survival. I'm more worried about whether you can take over that position. Sillin didn't say anything. Guan Feng patted Sillin and White Knight's head softly. Don't think too much. This is a good thing, and we'll get our answer soon enough. Guan Feng led Sillin and White Knight to a building. It wasn't tall, but it took up a lot of space. Unlike the desolation at the airport, there were a lot more people here, and they could hear a lot of people walking around. Everyone saluted and greeted Guan Feng when they saw him. Chief Wind. Greetings, Chief Wind. Many of these people weren't physically strong, probably because their main job was to work with their brains. However, they gave Sillin a very strange feeling. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. White Knight didn't say anything, but his eyes flickered a little when he looked at the people around him. He seemed to understand something. Even though there were more people here, most of them were still robots. They moved among the crowd in human form and didn't look aggressive at all. Guan Feng led Sillin and White Knight straight into a warehouse. It was an armory. Take whatever you need. There's no food though, so you'll have to deal with it yourselves. This is like a survival test in the wild, but this is all I can offer you, Guanfeng said. Sillin and White Knight had learned a bit about the planet's terrain from Gu Chang'an, so it was easier for them to choose which tools and weapons to bring with them. Guanfeng's Purgatory Thunder Snake was also on the weapon rack, but there was no Purgatory Thunder Snake S. Oh right, I found this in your kitchen, Coach Guan. Sillin took out the cylinder and the kid and passed them to Guanfeng. I didn't think you'd actually find it. Keep it, but don't use it. This gun isn't finished yet, so it could easily kill itself. It was true that Guanfeng had purposely left the gun in the kitchen, and he had done something to it. Some of the parts were assembled incorrectly, and the deflection wasn't right either. It didn't look like much, but there was no way that the gun would hit its target, and it could even kill itself. When Sillin was choosing his weapons, he didn't look for some cool-looking gun with compound functions. Instead, he looked for tools. Guanfeng was very satisfied with Sillin and White Knight's performance. The time limit is 30 days. If you can stay there for 30 days and survive, then you'll have completed the mission. Someone will come to pick you up when the time comes. Do your best and don't embarrass me. I've made a bet with someone before. Guanfeng sighed when he saw Sillin's expression. Don't look so reluctant. Just think of this as a semester test. If you pass it, I'll give you all A's in AF1 semester test. Sillin didn't care about the semester test. He was sure that he could pass it, but getting all A's was a bit tempting. After all, getting all A's was a good thing. I know. You're my tutor after all. If he didn't listen to his tutor, he might not even be able to graduate. Goryo had told Sillin this before. After they were done choosing, Guanfeng brought Sillin and White Knight to the rooftop. There were 2 airplanes parked there. Guanfeng and Sillin went up to one of them first. Do your best and don't embarrass me. If you pass, forget the semester test and the Purgatory Thunder Snake S, I'll support you even if you want to marry every girl in the school. Sillin leaned back in his seat and shot Guanfeng a sideways glance. You're talking a lot today, old man. Guanfeng chuckled and patted Sillin's head. Go and have some fun with the people inside. Sillin didn't know who the people Guanfeng was talking about were, but it couldn't be anything good. After Sillin left, Guanfeng looked at White Knight. Do you know why I sent you here? I kind of understand. I told you a long time ago that you're not an anomaly. You're not isolated. Guanfeng glanced at the people rushing back and forth downstairs and continued, you didn't join the army, you didn't join any noble force, you didn't join the Imperial Guard, and you even rejected Wing's invitation. Isn't it all because you want a suitable position? Now you have one, but whether or not you can get it depends on your own ability. I know. White Knight's voice wasn't loud, but it sounded like he was determined to get it. After White Knight left, a small old man in work clothes walked up to them. Are these the 2 you were talking about? The white-haired one is fine, but the black-haired one doesn't seem too willing. You're forcing a duck onto a perch. What can I do? These are the only 2 trump cards I can bring out. The other students aren't cut out for this at all. The small old man curled his lips. It's good enough that you even have one, not to mention that you're taking out 2 slots at once. Look at Gu Chang'an, he can't even take out one. At this point, the old man suddenly looked at Guanfeng. That white-haired kid, are you hoping that he can take over Gu Chang'an's seat? Guanfeng smiled but didn't say anything. This time, the small old man was surprised. That white-haired kid is that kind of person. He doesn't say anything, but I can't tell what kind of person he is. It looks like you've spent a lot of effort to cultivate him. Guanfeng looked in the direction where the plane disappeared. I was hoping for one, but I didn't expect to run into another one. I'm very satisfied with him in all aspects. Is that black-haired kid really that good? I really can't tell that you want him to take over your position. But you should also know that since he is not that kind of person, his requirements for this position are much higher. The little old man pointed at his own head as he emphasized the word here. This position of yours is the most difficult to pick. That being said, there's really no one who can compete with that black-haired kid this time. As long as he's alive in 30 days, he'll definitely take over. Even if he's unwilling, that person will find a way to trick him into taking over. I hope so. The plane Sillin was on autopilot, and it would let Sillin off once it reached its destination. Hui Mao didn't make a sound along the way. He looked very quiet with his eyes closed, but Sillin knew that Hui Mao was doing his best to gather information. If it was just because of Guan Feng, Sillin wouldn't have come here to participate in this bullshit test so easily. What did Black Viper's succession have to do with him? Sillin wasn't in the mood to care even if it was a fight for the throne. The reason he came here was to figure out one thing. What was the connection between Sigma's master and Black Viper? Gu Chang'an had shown them a couple of robots that looked similar to Sigma, and that was why Sillin decided to come here. Sigma's master had mastered intergalactic technology, so Sillin hoped that he could return to the League of Stars if he had the chance. While Sillin was deep in thought, an announcement came from inside the plane. Coordinates have arrived. Please get ready. Countdown begins. 3, 2, 1. As the last sound faded, Celine's feet left the ground, and she fell out of the plane. However, Sillin was prepared for this. He took out the buffering device and activated it, slowing down his fall. When he was close to the ground, Sillin turned off the device, jumped into the bushes, and dodged a couple of attacks in quick succession. When Sillin was landing, there was a flying beast staring at him from a tree branch not far away. If Sillin's jumping speed had been a beat slower, he would have been caught by the beast that flew past him at high speed. Dodging into the bushes, using the low bushes and dense branches, the dire beast finally gave up and left. Although the beast had left, it didn't mean that he was temporarily safe. Sillin withdrew his aura, held his breath, and hid behind a tree branch to observe his surroundings. Hui Mao crouched on a nearby tree and pressed his ears to the back of his head. His pupils were dilated. The bird in front of him seemed to taste pretty good. However, in order to cooperate with Sillin, Hui Mao refrained from attacking the bird that was pecking its claws. Footsteps approached him. They were very even, but each step was heavier than the last. Bio-soldier. Sillin quietly watched the bio-soldier, but he didn't make a move. Bio-soldiers had very developed hearing and hearing nerves, but their pain nerves were the opposite. So, even if you cut off their arms, they wouldn't feel any pain. Camouflage didn't have much effect on them. Bio-soldiers' retinas were different from ordinary people's. They could find their targets without camouflage. However, that was only if they were exposed. Sillin was hiding very well, so the bio-soldier didn't find him. The flying beast didn't attack the bio-soldier. It probably knew how powerful it was, so it didn't bother itself. The beasts here were all intelligent. Many times, they would even set traps to lure their prey. So, Sillin couldn't underestimate them. As long as he was careful and didn't make too much noise, he could smoothly pass the time. However, he still had to solve the problem of food. There were compressed rations in Sillin's ring, but he didn't want to use them. The bio-soldier walked further and further away, but Sillin's eyes stayed on it. He observed the changes in the muscles and the pulsation of the meridians with every step it took. This would allow Sillin to find the bio-soldier's weakness. No, he didn't have enough information. Sillin pondered on the spot for a moment. After the flying beast had left, he found a place and quickly made some arrangements. Then, he found a hidden spot to hide himself. He waited quietly. Hui Mao lay on a branch and wagged its tail. It was so boring. Suddenly, Weeze's ears twitched and it looked up to the sky. Through the tree branches, it saw another flying beast flying in their direction. Moreover, it was perched on a tree not far away from them. It was holding some unknown animal meat in its claws, and it was tearing and eating it. Hui Mao licked its lips and looked at Silin. Silin also noticed Hui Mao's thoughts. It just so happened that he also had an idea. On the branch, the 2-meter-tall flying beast was eating the meat. But when it ate, it would also pay attention to its surroundings to prevent others of its kind from stealing its food. However, this was a flying beast. It was completely unaware that a cat was crouching its body as it came over to this side silently. When this flying beast tore off a piece of meat and was about to swallow it, a gray shadow flashed by. Hui Mao bit the flying beast's neck so that it couldn't make a sound. However, its wings were flapping, and its claws broke the branches, but it still couldn't escape from the cat's mouth. The 2 bio-soldiers in the distance were attracted by the noise and walked over. Seeing that the bio-soldiers were coming over, Hui Mao jumped down the tree with the big bird in its mouth. Feeling that the big bird was too much, Hui Mao bit its neck and swung it against the tree stump a few times. Finally, it was much more obedient, and its wings didn't flap as hard as before. At this time, the 2 bio-soldiers were already running over. Although their steps were heavy, they weren't slow. Having achieved his goal, Hui Mao dragged the prey toward the trap that Silin had set up. He lured the 2 bio-soldiers there, and he controlled his speed well. The 2 bio-soldiers wouldn't lose track of him, nor would they be caught. When they reached the edge of the trap, Hui Mao jumped. Even with a big prey in his mouth, he could easily jump over the trap. The sudden appearance of thick vines tripped them, and as soon as they got up. Whoosh, 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 when they got up, some sharpened wooden arrows were shot at the 2 bio-soldiers. The range of the wooden arrows covered the front, back, left, and right of the bio-soldiers. The wooden arrows didn't cause any real damage to the 2 bio-soldiers. They didn't even break their skin. The bio-soldiers' brown skin was very thick, which gave them a very good defense. While the 2 bio-soldiers were busy dealing with the trap, Hui Mao opened its mouth wide and swallowed the big bird whole. Then, it lay on a branch not far from the trap and looked down at the scene below. It couldn't tell how to find a weakness, but Silin could. When dealing with bio-soldiers like this, it would either tear them apart or swallow them. Bio-soldiers don't taste good. I'll tear them apart the next time I see them. After the 2 bio-soldiers were attacked by the hard wooden arrows, some rocks came hurtling down from the surrounding trees. Most of the rocks were smashed into powder by the bio-soldiers' fists. Only a small portion of the rocks managed to hit the bio-soldiers. Similarly, they didn't break their skin. Be it the bio-weapons or the wild beasts, most of them were very sensitive to heat and electromagnetic waves. That was why Silin preferred to use more primitive tools. Before he actually took action, Silin thought that he had to find a way to quickly determine the bio-soldiers' weaknesses. Sharpening a knife wouldn't delay the work of cutting firewood. Silin was sharpening his knife. If he wanted to take out his prey with less effort, he needed to understand them well enough. Because there were too many things to deal with, the bio-soldiers' movements became more complicated. The movement of their muscles, the bulging of their veins, the changes in their breathing rate, the changes in their pupils. Silin noticed everything and started analyzing them as reference data. Finally, Silin decided to take action. He took out a small, sleeve-shaped crossbow he got from Guanfeng. It might be small, but the damage it fired was definitely comparable to that of a gun. Whoosh, an arrow accurately hit one of the bio-soldiers 7 centimeters below its ribs. The movement of the bio-soldier that was shot by the arrow became slower and slower until it finally stopped. Silin knocked another arrow and shot it at the remaining bio-soldier's abdomen. Just like the previous bio-soldier, after being shot, the bio-soldier's movements became slower and slower before coming to a complete stop. The arrow sank into the bio-soldier's body, and brown blood flowed down the arrow. Noticing that more bio-soldiers were coming their way, Silin waved his hand and signaled Hui Mao to get ready to escape. Before they left, Silin touched a bit of the bio-soldier's blood with a tree branch and wrapped it with leaves to prevent the smell of the blood from attracting other wild beasts. 6 or 7 bio-soldiers passed by after Silin and Hui Mao left. However, they only shot a curious glance at the 2 frozen bio-soldiers before leaving. After all the bio-soldiers had left, a figure emerged from the forest. It was a young girl. Although she looked very cute, her face was expressionless and expressionless. When her gaze fell on the 2 frozen bio-soldiers, a hint of curiosity finally appeared on her expressionless face. The girl walked over to them. She made almost no sound when she moved. The 2 bio-soldiers were completely dead, and brown blood was still dripping from their bodies. The girl looked at the 2 bio-soldiers for a moment before circling them once. Then, she stopped and took out a thin scalpel. 2 minutes later, the 2 bio-soldiers who were shot dead by Silin were still standing. It was hard to tell from their backs, but if someone walked up to them, they would definitely vomit if they didn't have good control over their bodies. The 2 bio-soldiers were dissected, and even their veins were peeled off one by one. The girl had already left, and it wasn't long before a scavenging wild beast smelled blood and came over to clean up the mess. In the end, everything returned to normal. All that was left was the wooden arrow that had been trampled into pieces and a puddle of brown blood. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.